Hey everybody, this is chapter 8 of Z.A. Jordan's The Evolution of Dialectical Materialism. The title of this chapter is Stalin's Socio-Cosmic Conception of the Universe. Many academic philosophers would be loath to concede that Stalin deserves a place in the annals of contemporary philosophy. Historians of philosophical thought, and in particular students of dialectical materialism, have no such doubts or inhibitions. Footnote. See J.M. Bachensky, Contemporary European Philosophy, pages 41 to 71, where Stalin is examined as a prominent representative of the philosophy of matter, side by side with Bertrand Russell, logical positivists, and logical empiricists, analytical philosophers, and philosophers of ordinary language. The rejection of the suggestion that Stalin should be passed over in silence does not imply a favorable evaluation of Stalin as a philosopher. See section 3 of this chapter. End footnote. As a rule, they consider dialectical materialism as an indivisible whole, a single doctrine which was established by Marx and Engels and which continued to develop with their successors, particularly Lenin and Stalin. Those students of dialectical materialism who recognize a legitimate succession in the philosophical leadership of the, quote, Marxist, end quote, school of thought feel, of course, no hesitation in regarding Stalin as an outstanding representative of the philosophy of, quote, Marxism, end quote, or Marxism-Leninism, a philosopher in his own right. Stalin's title writes to the name of philosopher based on two publications, Dialectical and Historical Materialism, 1938, and Marxism and Problems of Linguistics, 1950. According to Wikipedia, Dialectical and Historical Materialism by Joseph Stalin is a central text within the Soviet Union's political theory, Marxism-Leninism. The work first appeared as a chapter in the Short History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which drew heavily from the philosophical works of Georg, Wilhelm, Friedrich Hegel, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and Vladimir Lenin. It describes the Bolshevik Party's official doctrine on dialectical materialism and historical materialism. I'm going to skip to the synopsis of the book. Stalin's writing is systematically presented and divided into three parts. Part 1, outline of the Marxist dialectical method in contrast to metaphysics. A. Nature is a unified whole. B. Nature is in perpetual motion. C. Natural quantitative changes lead to qualitative changes. D. Natural phenomena possess internal contradictions as part of their struggle, leading to revolutionary rather than reformist change. Stalin relates this to capitalism by stating that, quote, the transition from capitalism to socialism and the liberation of the working class from the yoke of capitalism cannot be effected by slow changes, by reforms, but only by a qualitative change of the capitalist system, by revolution, end quote. Stalin. Part 2. Outline of the Marxist philosophical materialism in contrast to idealism. A. The world is materialistic in nature. B. Being is objective reality because it is material, and thus thinking is a reflection of matter contributing ideas back to being. C. The world and its laws are knowable as they can be examined by practice, challenging Kant's idea of, quote, things in themselves, end quote. Because of this, Stalin argues that there are laws of social development and that socialism is a science. Part 3. Historical Materialism. A. In this section, Stalin asks, what is the, quote, chief determinant force, end quote, in society? It is the mode of production of material goods, not the geographical environment or the growth of the population. As Stalin states, quote, this force, historical materialism holds, is the method of procuring the means of life necessary for human existence, the mode of production of material values, food, clothing, footwear, houses, fuel, instruments of production, etc., which are indispensable for the life and development of society, end quote. He also names two aspects of production, which are the instruments of production, and, quote, the relation of men to each other in the process of production, men's relations of production, end quote. B. The first feature of production, quote, it never stays at one point for a long time and is always in a state of change and development, and that furthermore changes in the mode of production inevitably call forth changes in the whole social system, social ideas, political views, and political institutions. They call forth a reconstruction of the whole social and political order, end quote. Stalin. Thus, the party of the proletariat must study the laws of the development of production so that it can, quote, proceed primarily from the laws of development of production, from the laws of economic development of society, end quote. C. In the second feature of production, Stalin states that, quote, its changes and development always begin with changes and development of the productive forces, and in the first place the changes and development of the instruments of production, end quote, and lays out the stages of history, which are primitive communism, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, and socialism. Additionally, the capitalist relations of production no longer correspond to the state of productive forces of society, creating irreconcilable contradictions. D. The third feature of production, quote, the rise of new productive forces and of the relations of production corresponding to these new productive forces, does not take place separately from the old system after the disappearance of the old system, but within the old system. It takes place not as a result of the deliberate and conscious activity of man, but spontaneously, unconsciously, independently of the will of man, end quote. Stalin. However, this spontaneous process of development does not mean that the change from old relations to new relations will occur smoothly. Rather, Stalin contends it will result in revolution. Okay. And Marxism and the Problem of Linguistics, 1950. I want to look that up. According to Wikipedia, Marxism and Problems of Linguistics is an article written by Joseph Stalin, most of which was first published on the 20th of June 1950 in the newspaper Pravda. The, quote, answers, end quote, attached at the end came later in July and August, end parenthesis, and was in the same year published as a pamphlet in large numbers. The article appeared in the context of the last wave of publications followed by followers of Nikolai Marr, who supported the Japhetic theory, attacking the, quote, old, end quote, linguistics that had started in Pravda on the 9th of May 1950. Yet instead of supporting Marr's linguistic theory, Stalin brought the campaign into a full term, decisively ending the acceptability of Marx's theories in Soviet science. The, quote, discussion, end quote, in the paper lingered a little longer, but did not bring much new due to the impossibility of arguing with Stalin, and the field of Soviet linguistics was effectively shifted. The next year, the Academy of Sciences published a hardbound volume of commentaries named, quote, Sessions of the Development of Social Sciences of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR, devoted to the anniversary of the publication of, quote, Marxism and Problems of Linguistics, end quote, running a print of 10,000. After the publication of this article, Marx's theories were largely abandoned by Soviet linguists, and emphasis on Russian language research was promoted instead. Back to the text. Stalin's title rights to the name of philosopher are based on two publications, Dialectical and Historical Materialism from 1938 and to Marxism and Problems of Linguistics from 1950. Those who support the conception of the doctrinal community and indivisibility of the, quote, philosophy of Marxism, end quote, frequently regard dialectical and historical materialism as the most authoritative statements of this philosophy. Although they recognize that Stalin's essay, is not an original work. They describe it as an intelligent summary of Lenin's views on the subject, notable for the conciseness and clarity of exposition, its common sense language free from confusing Hegelian terminology. Some competent Western philosophers go even further and believe that dialectical and historical materialism provides a reliable source of information about the Marxian concept of philosophy, quote, Marxist naturalism, end quote, or Marxist dialectics. Footnote. The first of the above-mentioned evaluations of dialectical and historical materialism, the book by Stalin, can be found in G.A. Vetter's Die Umkehrung Hegels. The second is implicitly accepted by H.B. Acton in his valuable study, The Illusion of the Epoch. End footnote. One need not share these views to recognize Stalin's importance in the evolution of dialectical materialism in general, and Soviet philosophy in particular. Stalin's philosophical contributions cannot be dismissed because Stalin carried some of Lenin's interpretations of dialectical materialism to their logical conclusions. Furthermore, they cannot be ignored because of the influence which Stalin exercised on the content, manner, and development of Soviet philosophy since the late 1920s, that is, for nearly 30 years. Finally, Stalin cannot be disregarded because of the social importance of Stalin's philosophical doctrine. The social importance of a philosophy should be assessed by the number of people who adhere to it and by the type of activity, the habit of thought and valuation which it originates and supports. It has rightly been observed that, quote, from this point of view, the philosophy of dialectical materialism is easily one of the most important doctrines of our times, end quote. Although Engels was its founder, dialectical materialism owes the distinction of being a socially influential philosophy to Stalin. Footnote. See Sidney Hook, Reason, Social Myths, and Democracy. It hardly needs mentioning that in the Soviet Union, Stalin enjoyed the reputation of a philosophical genius as long as Stalin was alive. This assessment does not seem to have been radically revised after Stalin's death in 1953 and Stalin's political demotion in 1956. The appearance of dialectical and historical materialism was hailed as an epoch-making development in Marxist-Leninist philosophy. In Stalin's lifetime, Soviet and other Marxist-Leninist philosophers never ceased to shower the highest praise upon Stalin's essay, which, as it was usually put at that time, quote, raised dialectical materialism to a new and higher level, end quote. To justify its, quote, world historical significance, end quote, M.B. Mitten, Stalin's court philosopher, suggested that in this essay, Stalin provided a comprehensive and systematic account of the materialist dialectics, which Marx had planned but never succeeded in writing, and which Engels and Lenin had failed to bring to completion in Dialectics of Nature and Philosophical Notebooks, respectively. According to Wikipedia, Mark Mitten lived from 1901 to 1987 and was a Soviet Marxist-Leninist philosopher, university lecturer, and professor of philosophy faculty of Moscow State University between 1964 and 1968 and between 1978 and 1985. Mark Mitten was interested primarily in dialectical and historical materialism, the philosophy of history, and criticism of bourgeois philosophy. It says, I skipped some bunch of stuff, but it says, in the 1920s, a debate raged within Soviet dialectical materialism between the mechanists and dialecticians of the Deborin school. Deborin was initially victorious, but Deborin was criticized by Mitten for, quote, Menshevizing idealism, end quote. Mitten led the Red professors in ousting Deborin. Mitten insisted that Deborin lacked party spirit and did not recognize the unity of theory and praxis. Footnote. See Vetter, Dialectical Materialism. When the, quote, cult of personality, end quote, was denounced in 1956, Stalin lost the status of one of the, quote, classics of Marxism-Leninism, end quote. But dialectical and historical materialism has continued to stand in high repute. The Foundations of Marxist Philosophy was first published in 1958, stated emphatically that dialectical and historical materialism, as well as other more specifically philosophical contributions of Stalin, are a, quote, valuable enrichment of Marxism, end quote. The same Soviet textbook described Stalin as an, quote, outstanding Marxist, end quote, who after Lenin's death continued to develop the, quote, philosophy of Marxism, end quote. Konstantinov. Whereas the importance of dialectical and historical materialism, the essay, for Soviet philosophy cannot be denied, the essay Dialectical and Historical Materialism's publication marked the moment when dialectical materialism lost the semblance of being a philosophical school of thought. Quote, dialectical materialism, end quote, wrote Stalin in the opening sentence of his essay, quote, is the world outlook of the Marxist-Leninist Party, end quote, Stalin. A World Outlook explains the short philosophical dictionary edited by Rosenthal and Uden is a system of beliefs, concepts, and ideas concerning the world as a whole. Footnote. We should distinguish between a world outlook and the wide and narrow meaning of this expression. A world outlook, in the first sense, contains the totality of views on man's natural and social environment. That is, it includes philosophical beliefs, social and political conceptions, moral, aesthetic, scientific, and other ideas. The core of every world outlook, or a world outlook in the narrower sense, is the philosophical beliefs. Okay, continuing along, a world outlook, Rosenthal and Uden continue, is not only a theoretical and cognitive significance, but also an enormous practical importance. As it expresses the views concerning the world as a whole, it determines the relation of people to their environment and to each other, serves as a guide to action, provides the direction of their activities supporting the advance of society, and thus speeds up its progress. Footnote. See Rosenthal and Uden's entry, quote, worldview in, there's a book called The Short Philosophical Dictionary. Stalin's announcement that dialectical materialism is the world outlook of the Marxist-Leninist Party indicated that in Stalin's interpretation, a cosmological and metaphysical inquiry has directly been used to justify the political program and party tactics in the reconstruction of society toward communism. While Marx tried to show that the laws of social development make the fall of the bourgeoisie and the victory of the proletariat equally inevitable, Stalin set out to prove that these events are indeed inevitable because the laws of social development are derivable from and determined by the revolutionary laws of the universe. Stalin turned into a philosopher to give the party a cosmic pat on the back. During Stalin's lifetime, his own version of dialectical materialism was often referred to as, quote, Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, end quote. This cumbersome expression was supposed to indicate that Stalin claimed the authority of both Marx and Lenin for his views, which he regarded as a new contribution to, quote, Marxism, end quote. Stalin said of Lenin that he expanded the doctrines of Marx and Engels and applied them to the new conditions of the struggle of the proletariat. Consequently, Leninism could not be either contrasted to or separated from, quote, Marxism. Similarly, Stalin neither abolished nor any old nor added any new propositions to the teaching of Marx and Engels, but continued faithfully in their tradition and developed it still further on the basis of the principles laid down by them. As a matter of fact, Stalin had more in common with Lenin than with either Marx or Engels, whom Stalin often quoted but rarely followed. If Lenin saw Marx through the eyes of Engels, Stalin saw both Marx and Engels through the eyes of Lenin. The fundamental though implicit assumption of dialectical and historical materialism, the essay, that the main use of philosophy and the principal task of the philosopher is to serve the political needs of the party, comes clearly from Lenin and not from Marx and Engels. It constituted the extreme conclusion drawn from the Leninist principle that in a class-divided society and in an ideologically divided world, every ideology, and ideology always includes a philosophy, expresses definite class interest. Consequently, knowledge has no intrinsic value but only an extrinsic and instrumental use as a means of social control over man's behavior and as the leverage of far-reaching social changes brought about by the change in human beliefs about the world and social environment. The socially and ideologically instrumental value of knowledge is not an invention of Lenin or Stalin. A philosopher of science will recognize that knowledge has an extrinsic value of which advantage has been taken, more or less consciously and for most varied purposes at all times and places. The peculiar characteristic of Lenin's and Stalin's position is their emphasis upon the social and ideological instrumentalism of knowledge with the exclusion of its other values and, in particular, of its cognitive function, upon which both the practical and the non-practical extrinsic functions of knowledge ultimately depend. In this respect, Lenin and Stalin differ only from many philosophers outside the Soviet Union, not only from many philosophers outside the Soviet Union, but also from Marx and Engels. New section. Philosophical materialism. The expression Marxist philosophical materialism, the expression, quote, Marxist philosophical materialism, end quote, seems to be a term peculiar to Stalin and to Soviet philosophy in the Stalinist period. Footnote. In Rosenthal and Uden, there is a separate entry, quote, Marxist philosophical materialism, end quote. It was used occasionally, the term Marxist philosophical materialism was used occasionally by Lenin to refer to what Lenin also called the, quote, materialist theory of knowledge, end quote, that is, the peculiar combination of epistemological materialism, the causal theory of knowledge, and the copy theory of perception, or to any one of these doctrines separately. See, for example, materialism and empiriocriticism. By distinguishing philosophical materialism from dialectical materialism, Lenin wished to have a term which would enable Lenin to speak of the materiality of the phenomena of nature with the explicit exclusion of their dialectical character. Footnote. Lenin may also have made the distinction in order to emphasize the fact that Lenin regarded the philosophy of Marx as a synthesis of materialist tradition and the philosophy of Hegel. End footnote. Thus, dialectical materialism is a more specific conception than philosophical materialism, or, as the Short Philosophical Dictionary puts it, philosophical materialism is a component part of dialectical materialism. The expression, quote, philosophical, end quote, qualified, quote, materialism, end quote, to underline the fact that the assumption of materialism were formulated in terms of the philosophical instead of the scientific concept of matter and express propositions more certain and fundamental than those which science could ever provide. While Lenin used the term, quote, philosophical materialism, end quote, only rarely and defined its meaning implicitly rather than explicitly, Stalin made frequent use of it and gave it the status of a terminus technicus. Stalin listed three principal features of Marxist philosophical materialism. First, philosophical materialism maintains that, quote, the world is by its very nature material, end quote. That is, quote, the multifold phenomenon of the world constitute different forms of matter in motion, end quote. And that the world develops in accordance with the laws of motion inherent in matter itself. Footnote. Stalin seems to have referred to Engels' consistently held view that the whole diversity of physical processes can be, quote, resolved into variously differentiated forms of motion of matter, passing into one another according to definite laws, end quote. Engels, Dialectics of Nature, end footnote. Second, philosophical materialism holds that matter is an objective reality existing outside and independent of the cognizing subject, and that matter is, quote, the source of sensations, ideas, consciousness, end quote. Matter is primary and consciousness is secondary, and the latter is a reflection of the former. Third, philosophical materialism asserts that there are no unknowable things in the world, but only those which are still unknown and which, quote, the effort of science and practice, end quote, will make known. Stalin, Dialectical and Historical Materialism. The three fundamental principles of philosophical materialism in Stalin's exposition are a peculiar arrangement of various beliefs and views, all of which can be found either in Engels or in Lenin. The purpose of this arrangement, by no means always consistent, is not clear at first sight. Stalin's first principal feature of philosophical materialism combines Engels' assumption of the material unity of the world, that is, of materialist monism, and his absolute materialism. The thesis of materialist monism states that matter is the only reality, and matter's development stands in no need of any outside principle, such as mind, consciousness, or spirit, to account for the diversity of matter's forms. The monistic view, that there is but one fundamental reality, matter, is reinforced by the assumption that nothing but different forms of matter and motion are real. Engels' principles are metaphysical principles in the traditional meaning of metaphysical principle, this term, metaphysical principles. Engels' principles make assertions about being as such, and these assertions clearly transcend the limitations of ordinary and scientific knowledge. The metaphysical beliefs which Stalin does not try to substantiate, the metaphysical beliefs are supposed to be rigorously derived generalizations of the findings of science, and consequently, the metaphysical beliefs which Stalin does not try to substantiate, validation, remains the responsibility of science and not of philosophy, are supported by the cosmological principle of universal lawfulness. This principle of universal lawfulness states that all phenomena are determined in accordance with objective laws. Stalin implied that the cosmological postulate of universal orderliness and conformity to law is incompatible with the existence of God. In philosophical notebooks, Lenin quoted Heraclitus' views about the world being created neither by God nor by any man. The world, Heraclitus was reported to have said, quote, was and is, quote, was, is, and will be eternally living fire, regularly becoming ignited and regularly becoming extinguished, end quote. Lenin commented on Heraclitus' statement that it was, quote, a very good exposition of the principles of dialectical materialism, end quote, and Stalin quoted Lenin with approval. The universe does not need a creator and ruler if the universe is a self-contained unity in which eternally moving matter changes in conformity to laws. Stalin justified Stalin's theological principle, there is no God, by another reference to Engels. Engels argued that there is no place for, quote, an extramundane creator, end quote. Once the view is accepted that, quote, the material, sensuously perceptible world to which we ourselves belong is the only reality, end quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. Engels' assertion remains valid irrespective of whether it is given a materialistic or naturalistic interpretation. If only real objects given directly or indirectly in sense experience exist and are real, and God is not such an object by definition, the existence of God cannot be asserted. This is the view to be found in the young Marx, who drew precisely this conclusion from his anthropological materialism. Once man is a natural being, and a nature as a reality shaped by man, are recognized in his life experience, the search for an alien being, outside man and nature, becomes impossible in practice. Consequently, atheism as a denial of this unreality is also no longer meaningful. One does not deny what cannot be affirmed. No unambiguous statement can be found in Stalin to answer the question as to whether Stalin did or did not regard matter as material substance. In Materialism and Imperial Criticism, Lenin repeatedly warned his adherents that the recognition of eternally moving and changing matter should not be confused with the belief in the existence of the immutable material substratum of things, which belief is incompatible with dialectical materialism. Therefore, it is fairly certain that Stalin followed in Lenin's footsteps and did not deviate from his established tenet of dialectical materialism. Footnote. Plekhanov argues that both Lenin and Stalin accepted the existence of material substance. The only statement in Dialectical and Historical Materialism by Stalin, which seems to support Plekhanov's view, quote, matter is the subject of all changes, end quote, is an excerpt from H.F. I don't know what H.F. is from. In this particular passage, H.F. So it says Marx. Can't think of what H.F. is from. Holy Family. Oh, Jesus Christ. In this particular passage of Holy Family, Marx described Hobbes' views on matter and not Marx's own. Stalin did not quote Marx to enlist Marx's authority in support of the belief in the existence of material substance. Stalin's second principal feature of philosophical materialism combines into a single whole Lenin's epistemological materialism. The second principal feature of philosophical materialism combines into a single whole Lenin's epistemological materialism. Matter is an objective reality existing outside and independent of our consciousness, and Engels' genetic materialism. Matter is primary and consciousness or mind is matter's product and reflection. It should be remembered that Lenin had joined them together, failing to distinguish materialism from realism and consider the two conceptions as inferentially equivalent. However, from the belief in the existence of an objective reality independent of the cognizing subject, we cannot draw the inference that consciousness and mind emerge from matter. It is exactly this fallacious inference that is incorporated by Stalin, as a matter of course, into his second principal feature of philosophical materialism. He clearly took it for granted that epistemological realism involved genetic materialism and merged the metaphysical or cosmological thesis concerning the primacy of matter over consciousness with the ontological and epistemological assumption concerning the priority of the objects of knowledge in relation to the knowing subject. Footnote. Stalin only followed Lenin when he assumed that these metaphysical and epistemological issues were substantially identical. End footnote. Stalin asserted that the premises, parenthesis A, the brain is, quote, matter which in its development has reached a high degree of perfection, end quote, and B, the brain is the organ of thought, entail the conclusion that thought is a product of matter. Stalin's description of the relationship between matter, brain, and thought has been criticized not only as an instance of confused reasoning, but also as a belief shared by dialectical materialism with, quote, classical materialism, end quote, in general, and the vulgar materialism of the 19th century in particular. This criticism does not appear to be valid. What Stalin did was to repeat unhesitatingly Lenin's polemical assertion, quote, the brain is the organ of thought, and thought is a function of the brain, end quote, directed against Avenarius, who had refuted exactly these views as misleading or false. See Lenin, Materialism and Imperial Criticism. Unlike Avenarius, Lenin was not interested in the fact that the propositions, quote, the brain is the organ of thought, end quote, and, quote, thought is a product of the brain, end quote, express relations which cannot be established by sense experience, observation, and experiment. For Lenin, these statements were clearly true, because these statements were inferences from the true assumptions of genetic materialism. Moreover, the attribution to matter of a power productive of novelty, common to all versions of dialectical materialism, or the supposition that thought and sensation are associated with the higher forms of organic matter from which they emerged, is not a thesis of vulgar materialism. Footnote. This is the supposition which ascribes to reality a multi-level structure and holds that reality consists of irreducible domains of phenomena. Bochensky recognizes that this supposition, which he calls categorialer pluralismus, I guess that's categorical pluralism, is part of Lenin's and Stalin's dialectical materialism. End footnote. Lenin did not wish to endorse the reductive fallacy of mechanistic materialism, of which, like Engels, Lenin was no supporter, but to accomplish what Lenin called, quote, the materialist elimination of the, quote, dualism of body and spirit, end quote, end quote. Although Lenin and Stalin treated the subject inadequately and expressed themselves clumsily and misleadingly, the objection that they embraced vulgar materialism cannot be sustained. Stalin closed the list of the principal features of philosophical materialism with a declaration of unbounded optimism to the effect that there were no epistemological or ontological limits to the progress of scientific knowledge. Stalin dealt with the question of the reach of science in a manner reminiscent of the philosophical disputes in the 19th century and unrelated to the present-day problems of the limits of knowledge. Neither in content nor formulation does Stalin's declaration differ from Engels or Lenin's similar professions of confidence. According to Stalin, three assertions should be distinguished in the theory of knowledge of philosophical materialism. A, quote, the world and the world's laws are fully knowable, end quote. B, quote, the knowledge of the laws of nature, ... is authentic knowledge having the validity of objective truth, end quote. C, quote, there are no things in the world which are unknowable, but only things which are still unknown, end quote. Stalin, Dialectical and Historical Materialism. Although Stalin quoted Engels', quote, telling refutation, end quote, of the Kantian epistemology in support of his statements, Stalin clearly followed Lenin's rather than Engels' lead. For Lenin, the unrestricted knowability of the world was a direct consequence of genetic materialism, as well as the universality of the laws of dialectics, applying equally to the external world and human thought. If reason and consciousness are products of the human brain, and man himself is a product of nature, the knowledge of nature produced by the brain cannot but faithfully reflect nature. This train of reasoning is repeatedly stated and restated by Lenin in the third chapter of Materialism and Imperial Criticism, and succinctly summed up in the philosophical notebooks, in the assertion that, quote, knowledge is the reflection of nature by man, end quote. For Lenin, it was self-contradictory to recognize the truth of his epistemological materialism and to reject the belief in the full knowability of the world. The question can and should be asked, however, why Stalin introduced the materialist theory of knowledge among the principal features of philosophical materialism, which is a cosmological or metaphysical doctrine. The answer seems to be that Stalin was as much inclined as Lenin to consider the copy theory of perception the only theory of knowledge compatible with materialism. To hold that matter is the objective reality existing outside our mind, and to believe that our sensations are the true copy of this objective reality was, for Lenin, quote, one and the same thing, end quote. Lenin, materialism and empirical-criticism. Lenin accepted this equivalence in defense of materialism against epistemological criticism. Stalin adhered to Lenin's assumption on account of its alleged social and political implications. That only the copy theory of perception is compatible with materialism is an extremely doubtful view. Even on the supposition that genetic materialism is true, it does not follow that the internal world of sensations merely reflects the external world of material objects in a passive manner, without adding anything to what is given. If the epistemological dualism of the theory of representative perception, of which the copy theory is a particular case, ultimately implies psychophysical dualism, a materialist could not hold the copy theory of perception without contradiction. Furthermore, monistic materialism certainly does not imply that perception, memory, and other cognitive experiences are mirror-like images of the entities in the external world. A materialist can only gain by adherence to the view that we know material objects directly, that is, the data of perception consist of the same realities of which the perceived objects are composed. Lenin failed to analyze all these issues. Lenin did not succeed in providing a convincing argument in favor of the close connection between materialism and his theory of knowledge, and arbitrarily decided in advance that what cannot thus be resolved. There is no justification for the belief that materialism is factually or logically bound up with the Lockean conception which maintains that knowledge is a mere reflection resulting from the action of the environment upon the cognizing subject and engraved upon the mind, which is a tabula rasa. There is only a historical fusion of materialism and Locke's theory of knowledge. Neither is there any reason to accept Lenin's opinion that sensation is regarded by all science, quote, as an image of the external world, end quote. That this naive realistic theory of knowledge is widely, if not universally, endorsed by scientists, and that it has been unconsciously and instinctively taken over from them by all sane humanity. Footnote. Lenin's assertion that this copy theory of perception was widely endorsed by scientists probably referred to Heinrich Hertz's Introduction to the Principles of Mechanics. Lenin described Hertz as a scientist, quote, who has been intimidated by the professorial hue and cry against the, quote, metaphysics, end quote, of materialism, but who nevertheless cannot overcome his instinctive conviction of the reality of the external world, end quote. Lenin, Materialism and Imperial Criticism. It should be emphasized that Hertz's concept of symbols, parenthesis, quote, pictures, quote, images, end parenthesis, used in scientific discourse has nothing to do with Lenin's epistemology. Hertz's, quote, build is not Lenin's, quote, image, for Hertz used it in the sense which the word, quote, idea had in the Old English terminology, and should be translated as, quote, concept, or better perhaps, quote, construct. Contrary to what Lenin tried to show, end footnote. Contrary to what Lenin tried to show, and what Stalin repeated for reasons of Stalin's own, there is not one and only one standpoint of materialism in the theory of knowledge. Materialism is also compatible with a conception of cognition, which regards knowledge as the result of a process of interaction between the subject and his natural and social environment. Within a materialist ontology, the anthropological realism of Marx, formulated in economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, the German ideology and the theses on Feuerbach, provides an alternative solution to this problem. Stalin endorsed Lenin's view about the equivalence of epistemological materialism and the copy theory of perception because it allegedly implied the existence of objective social and political truth. Stalin argued that if the world is fully knowable, society is fully knowable too, and the study of social life becomes a science. Therefore, practical policies can be conclusively established as the application of, or deductions from, the laws of the development of society. The materialist theory of knowledge makes of the party program, as it were, a demonstrable faith, countenanced by the orderliness and lawfulness of the universe. The existence of objective social and political truth seems in turn to support a hierarchical, technocratic, and authoritarian power structure in society. There is another reason why Stalin regarded Lenin's theory of knowledge as one of the principal features of philosophical materialism. In Materialism and Imperial Criticism, Lenin emphasized over and over again that if knowledge does not depict objective reality, but is a form of specifically human experience, determined both by the external world and the cognizing subject, man becomes free to create for himself concepts of all kinds and, in particular, the idea of God. Quote, "Once you deny objective reality, given us in sensation," end quote, warned Lenin, quote, "you have already lost one of your weapons against fideism," or fideism, end quote. On the other hand, if the world is fully knowable, and knowledge is a faithful, copy-like reflection of reality, quote, "beyond the external world, with which everyone is familiar, there can be nothing," end quote. Lenin, Materialism and Imperial Criticism. Lenin was sure that the refutation of fideism was socially desirable and imperative for the exposure of religious illusions, revolutionizes thought, changes the ways of viewing the world and the value orientation of people, and makes people anxious to work for socialism. Stalin, like Lenin, needed a philosophy which would induce and promote the social attitudes supposed to be favorable to the construction of socialism. He adopted Lenin's theory of knowledge and made it one of the foundation stones of orthodoxy, since he had implicit faith in its alleged social and political implications and its instrumental value in establishing control over all fields of thought. Section 2. Dialectical method. According to the Stalinist schoolmen, the Marxist dialectical method is the second component part of dialectical materialism. In Dialectical and Historical Materialism, the book, the essay, Stalin dealt first with the nature of dialectics and only later proceeded to explain the nature of materialism. The order of inquiry has puzzled some students of Soviet Marxism, for it is clearly illogical. Footnote. H. Ogiermann devoted a whole book, Materialistische Dialectik, to this puzzling order of inquiry and its various ramifications. A possible explanation of why Stalin departed from the logical order in his presentations of the two main parts of dialectical materialism will be considered later. End footnote. We must first know what matter is before we can discover matter's principal features or establish the best method for the investigation of matter's properties. Stalin offered no justification of his procedure, which during his lifetime was obligatory for all, and no satisfactory explanation has been provided by anybody else either. Since Stalin's death, the earlier more rational arrangement, the account of materialism, precedes that of dialectics, seems to prevail in Soviet philosophy. It should be emphasized that, for Stalin, the Marxist dialectical method was a general theory of reality first and foremost, and a method only by implication. In this sense, Stalin sharply revised the views of Engels, Plekhanov, and Lenin, for whom the dialectical method has been what the term itself indicated: a method first and foremost, and an ontology only by implication. It is true, of course, that for Engels, Plekhanov, and Lenin, dialectics was also a real dialectic, in Hegel's terminology, an immanent force inherent in all things and phenomena of nature and society. The existence and properties of this force, however, were established by inference from the alleged successful application of the dialectical rules of procedure in the investigation of nature and society. Stalin also sharpened the distinction between the dialectical and metaphysical mode of thought and transformed them into two rival theories of reality, opposed to each other as much as by their respective ontological assumptions as by their incompatible social functions. The second revision of dialectics, for which Stalin was responsible, had widespread and far-reaching implications. Engels closely associated dialectics with a monistic and dynamic conception of nature, which was prepared by the advance of scientific knowledge in the 18th and 19th centuries, but which was due, in his opinion, above all to Hegel. He contrasted this new conception of nature, based on what he called the, quote, dialectical mode of thought, end quote, with the old mechanistic conception that made use of what he referred to as the, quote, metaphysical mode of thought, end quote. The latter investigated nature as the totality of things isolated from each other, as, quote, also as, quote, fixed, rigid, given once for all, end quote, that is unchanging and immutable. The former examined the totality of natural objects as a vast, fundamentally indivisible system, all of which parts are connected with and reciprocally act upon each other. They are all engulfed in a swiftly flowing stream of change and subjected to an irresistible process of evolution, which transforms the world as a whole and every part of it without interruption. As Engels put it, the view that the natural, historical, and intellectual world moves and transforms itself endlessly in a constant process of becoming and passing away requires a philosophy and science, striving each in its particular domain for the discovery of the laws of this process of transformation. While Engels described the distinction between dialectics and metaphysics in terms of two historically different conceptions of the universe, and differentiated them by what he called, quote, mode of thought, end quote, quote, method of work, end quote, or, quote, habit of observing natural objects, end quote, Stalin translated the historical and methodological differences into substantive differences, expressive of the basic social conflict dividing humanity everywhere and at all times. Both dialectics and metaphysics became a general theory of reality and were conceived as mutually exclusive by their content and implications. While dialectics held that all events were interconnected and dynamic, subject to laws and progressive evolution, metaphysics rejected these assertions. According to metaphysics, events were isolated from each other and static, and nature knew neither lawfulness nor development unless it was a repetition of what had already occurred. It should be noted that dialectics and metaphysics in Stalin's sense were absolute doctrines, the concepts of which dialectics and metaphysics made use admitted no difference of degree. Changeability was to be either ubiquitous or not to apply at all. Everything was to be either interrelated with or completely isolated from everything else. All events were to conform to laws or be merely a matter of chance. Development was to be either all-pervasive or utterly apparent. Thus, what dialectics asserted, metaphysics denied, and there was nothing to mediate between dialectics and metaphysics' respective positions, set in every respect at opposite poles. Moreover, metaphysics and dialectics were no longer two cosmological conceptions of nature, which emerged successively in the advance of knowledge, but were considered as opposed to each other, as a Soviet textbook put it, as a Soviet textbook put it, in, quote, the course of the whole development of science and philosophy, end quote. Quote, the history of philosophy is also the history of dialectics, the history of the struggle of dialectics and metaphysics, end quote. Stalin, Dialectical and Historical Materialism. Engels' distinction between dialectics and metaphysics as the two successive cosmological conceptions and modes of thought turned in Stalin's hands into two distinctive Weltanschauungen, each existentially or socially determined. What underlies Stalin's interpretation is the belief that thought is not independent, neither in thought's origin nor validity, of the situation peculiar to the social group in the midst of which it originates, but is bound by this situation as well as by the objectives, necessities, and other requirements of collective action. A certain point of view is adopted because it grows out of a definite social reality and favors the attainment of a definite group or class purposes. Stalin asserted that the metaphysical and the dialectical Weltanschauungen have their respective social basis in the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and are closely associated with the political and social interests of these two classes. It is no accident, for instance, that proletarian thinkers regard the universe in terms of a system in which everything is connected with everything else in conformity to laws, and that bourgeois thinkers see nature as an agglomeration of isolated things, subject only to chance. The connection between the social position of the thinker and the thinker's Weltanschauung follows inevitably from the determinants inherent in this situation. Moreover, a theory, a point of view, or an idea are expressions of the social and economic interest of their bearers. They are either useful or harmful to the social classes in the realization of their collective objectives and, more generally, either facilitate or hamper the progress of society. Thus, dialectics is essentially unacceptable in the capitalist countries, in which the ruling class considers capitalism naturally a transient state of affairs, as a permanent order of the world, and sees in change and development its own destruction. The bourgeoisie is bound to repudiate the view that everything in the universe is in flux, and to embrace the belief that permanence and immutability are fundamental determinations of all natural phenomena. Stalin's third revision of dialectics consisted in the incorporation of some characteristics of the dialectical mode of thought into dialectics conceived as a general theory of reality. Stalin thus introduced two new laws of dialectics, which may be called the, quote, law of universal connections, end quote, and the, quote, law of universal mutability, end quote. As cosmological propositions, they attribute some important characteristics to reality. Contrary to Engels, Stalin maintained that the two new laws of dialectics are not the common intellectual property of the contemporary view of nature, but are recognized only by dialectical materialists and ignored or explicitly rejected by everybody else. Quote, contrary to metaphysics, dialectics does not regard nature as an accidental agglomeration of things, of phenomena unconnected with, isolated from, and independent of each other, but as a connected and integral whole in which things, phenomena are organically connected with, dependent on, and determined by each other. Contrary to metaphysics, dialectics holds that nature is not a state of rest and immobility, stagnation and immutability, but a state of continuous movement and change, of continuous renewal and development, where something is always arising and developing, and something always disintegrating and dying away, end quote. Stalin. There's a footnote that I missed. Since Stalin's death, the two laws are no longer listed among the laws of dialectics. The concepts of reciprocal connections and universal mutability, like those of matter, movement, time, space, quality, and quantity, contradiction, causality, necessity, and some others, are treated as categories, that is, as, quote, the fundamental logical notions, which reflect the most general and essential relationships and relations of things and phenomena, end quote. End footnote. Stalin's fourth revision of dialectics concerns the number of dialectical laws. Stalin introduces the two new laws and reduces Engels' three original laws to two by eliminating the law of the triad, or the negation of the negation. In Stalin's version, dialectical materialism includes 4 dialectical laws as compared with 3 in Engels, and 2 or possibly 1 in Plekhanov and Lenin respectively. Neither Plekhanov nor Lenin favor the law of the negation of the negation, and both Plekhanov and Lenin were inclined to drop the law of the negation as a rudiment, as a redundant, or as a survival from the past, incompatible with scientific materialism. Stalin's rejection of the law of the triad was absolute and unconditional. Stalin ignored it entirely and never mentioned the law of the triad. Stalin's sense of realism provided no protection against excessive philosophical simplifications, but occasionally saved Stalin from falling victim to fanciful and unrestrained speculations. The post-Stalinist philosophy in the Soviet Union has resorted has restored the law of the negation to the original prominence given to the law of the negation of the negation. The original prominence given to the law of the negation by Engels. For the law of the negation conveys, according to the book The Foundations of Marxist Philosophy, the most general idea concerning the nature of development and progress. Footnote: even in Poland, where the Marxist-Leninist philosophers have done much to eliminate the Hegelian survivals from dialectical materialism, efforts were made to salvage the law of the triad from complete oblivion. Of Engels' three laws of dialectics, Stalin retained two, namely the transformation of quantity into quality, including the doctrine of leaps and the unity of opposites. In the arrangement of these two laws, he followed Engels, not Lenin's order of priority. This is not without socio-cosmic significance. Footnote: in this respect, nothing has been changed since Stalin's death. The way in which the dialectical laws are now ordered follows the pattern of Engels and Stalin, and not that of Lenin. End footnote. In Stalin's presentation, the laws of dialectics differ in their number and content from anything to be found in his predecessors. None of them had as many laws as Stalin, and none formulated them as lucidly and punctiliously. The order in which Stalin arranged his dialectical laws is peculiar to Stalin himself and reflects Stalin's didactic and political purpose. Both of Stalin's dialectical laws proper are conceived as laws of evolution, while the law of the transformation of quantity into quality is to explain how the process of change gives rise to, quote, an onward and upward movement, end quote. The law of the unity of opposites is intended to account for the origin of change and motion. Footnote: see Vetter, Dialectical Materialism. Apart from an emphatic reassertion of the view that nature and life in all their manifestations are the product of development, the dialectical evolutionism of Stalin reveals a curious affinity to the Bergsonian criticism of modern science and contrasts the metaphysical or mechanistic concept of evolutionary change with the concept of dialectical or creative evolution. The distinction between mechanistic and creative evolution goes back to Engels and Plekhanov. Engels argued tirelessly that evolution based on the principle of, quote, causa aequat effectum cannot account for numerically or quantitatively new objects and for the process of growth, in which growth is nothing but the unfolding of ever-present potentialities. Apparently that phrase I just said, causa aequata effectum, means the cause is equal to the effect. One second. So Engels argued tirelessly that evolution based on the principle Engels argued tirelessly that evolution based on the principle causa aequat effectum, which means the cause is equal to the effect, cannot account for numerically or quantitatively new objects and for the process of growth, in which growth is nothing but the unfolding of ever-present potentialities. This conception of evolution was attributed by Engels to mechanistic philosophy, which regarded everything as given once and for all, and which was concerned solely with repetition, with change without novelty, and with a universe without history. Engels rejected this view of evolution and embraced a theory of change that was no longer compatible with the old maxim of causality. Two footnotes. See M. Bunga, Causality, where the history of these two conceptions of evolution is traced and analyzed. And the next footnote says, there's no evidence to support the view that Engels extended his criticism of the mechanistic conception of change to Darwin's theory of evolution, which surely did not make use of the mechanistic, but of the non-mechanistic pattern of change. In the Stalinist period, however, this was overlooked. Darwin's successors, and present-day philosophers were all presented as representatives and defenders of the mechanistic conception of change. End footnote. In Engels' doctrine of causality, the principle, quote, causa aequat effectum, no longer holds. His doctrine of evolution allows for emergence of entities endowed with entirely new properties and conforming to an entire set of new laws, that is, for what we would describe as the emergence of a new level of being. Thus, in Engels' the law of the transformation of quantity into quality represented the groping for a law of evolutionary cosmology. It was also Engels' assumption, taken over from Hegel, that the transition from an old qualitative state to a new qualitative state and the emergence of novelty was accomplished by a, quote, leap or, quote, jump, by a break of causal chains which enables the vital impetus of the creative force to proliferate into new forms and species. The doctrine of leaps was further elaborated and put into relief by Plekhanov, but for the benefit of revolutionary activities rather than for the purpose of explaining the passage from the inorganic to the organic world or of accounting for the mutations exhibited by living matter. Like his predecessors, Stalin clearly rejected the thesis of the equivalence between cause and effect and adopted the law of the transformation of quantity into quality as a law of cosmological evolution, qualitative leaps being the modus operandi of the emergence of qualitatively richer entities and higher levels of being. Stalin regarded the process of development as the, quote, transition from an old qualitative state to a new qualitative state, end quote, as the, quote, development from the simple to the complex, from the lower to the higher, end quote, as a, quote, onward and upward movement, end quote. Stalin, Dialectical and Historical Materialism. Development of this sort involves change with novelty, the emergence of a higher level of being, and what Stalin called a, quote, leap to a new state, end quote. The examples of the creative development given by Stalin, quote, the transition from the insentient world to the sentient world, from the kingdom of inorganic matter to the kingdom of organic life, end quote. Make it clear that what he meant was the doctrine of emergent evolution. The doctrine of emergent evolution in Engels, Lenin, and Stalin is a scheme of things which is much more determined by ideological considerations than may appear at first sight. The mechanistic conception of change with its explicit or implicit denial of the emergence of novelty would not explain the question as to the origin of the apparent diversity of natural things and left open the possibility of a supernatural source, whether spirit or God. The maxim that there can be nothing in the effect that has not been in the cause is entirely compatible with the assumption that the cause is either higher than or equal to the effect. In both cases, it is possible to argue that the variety of natural things requires a creator. As has been pointed out earlier, the doctrine of emergent evolution was supposed to show that a positive philosophy of nature could do without natural theology. The doctrine of emergent evolution also enabled its supporters to justify the necessity or inevitability of social upheavals and political revolutions as preordained by the universal laws of nature. Stalin was as emphatic on this point as Plekhanov and Lenin had been, since the passage from, quote, imperceptible quantitative change to open fundamental changes, end quote, does not occur gradually but, quote, rapidly and abruptly, taking the form of a leap from one state to another, end quote. The revolutionary overthrow of the old relations of production and the establishment of new productive relations is a natural and inevitable phenomenon of social progress. Progress cannot be checked, for evolution and revolution prepare the ground for each other and follow relentlessly upon each other. Quote, evolution prepares for revolution and creates the ground for revolution. Revolution consummates the process of evolution and facilitates its further activity. End quote. Stalin, Anarchism or Socialism, and Dialectical and Historical Materialism. However, the same socio-cosmic considerations which prompted Stalin to assume the doctrine of emergent evolution and the universality of the emergence of novelty by an abrupt leap persuaded him later to revise his views. In Marxism and the Problem of Linguistics, Stalin put certain limitations on the doctrine of leaps as applied to social phenomena. Let us call a society in which classes have incompatible interest a, quote, antagonistic class society, end quote, and that in which classes have different but no longer mutually exclusive interest a, quote, non-antagonistic class society, end quote. According to the revised doctrine of leaps, the, quote, law of transition from an old quality to a new by means of an explosion, end quote, still holds good in an antagonistic class society. In a non-antagonistic class society, however, the development of some social phenomena, whether they belong to the superstructure or should be included in the basis, does not necessarily occur by an abrupt leap. Furthermore, according to the new interpretation, some ideologically neutral elements of the superstructure, such as language and technology, are never subject to the law of development by leaps and develop gradually, without any breach of continuity. As Stalin put it, under the conditions characteristic of a non-antagonistic class society, social development may be accomplished by the gradual accumulation of the new and by the gradual disappearance of the old quality. In a non-antagonistic class society, and economic development, quote, proceeds not by way of upheavals, but by way of gradual changes, the old not simply being abolished out of hand, but changing its nature in adaptation to the new, and retaining only its form, while the new does not simply destroy the old, but infiltrates the old, changes the old's nature and the old's functions, without smashing the old's form, but utilizing the old's form for the development of the new. End quote. Stalin. Stalin's pronouncement on how the operation of the law of transformation from an old quality into a new might take on a gradual form is of no theoretical interest. Footnote. Stalin's revision of the theory of leaps continues to be recognized in the post-Stalinist period without reference to Stalin's name. See Konstantinov GmbH. I forget what that stands for. It is ironic to observe that Lenin once described the rejection of the doctrine of leaps as a clear indication of revisionism or reformism. See his Differences in the European Labor Movement by Lenin. But as soon as Lenin achieved power, Lenin ridiculed those who did not understand that, quote, by leap, end quote, the teachers of socialism meant changes in world history, and that leaps of this kind extended over periods of 10 years and even more, end quote. Lenin, in The Immediate Tasks of the Soviet Government. End footnote. The true purpose of the revision is apparent. If the original doctrine of leaps were universally valid, and revolution rather than evolution remained the vehicle of progressive change, Soviet society could not be spared the breach of continuity and the upheavals in its social and political advance. But Stalin no longer wished to instigate change. Stalin was anxious, above all, to preserve the Soviet social and political order, and to protect the Soviet social and political order from change and destruction. The revision of the doctrine of leaps is significant psychologically and politically, but not theoretically, and again confirms the view that Stalin's dialectical materialism had its roots in Stalin's political outlook. The, quote, internal contradictions were inherent in all things and phenomena of nature, end quote, is a principle which Stalin announced with much firmness and authority. On the other hand, his examples of internal contradictions clearly indicate that he gave the term, quote, contradiction, end quote, a non-technical meaning. Stalin's internal contradictions are not of a logical nature. They are meant to refer to the polar structure in the composition of natural objects or to the absence of homogeneity. Thus, Stalin argued that internal contradictions are inherent in all things and phenomena of nature, for they exhibit, quote, the interaction of opposed forces, end quote. And, quote, all have their negative and positive side, a past and a future, something dying away and something developing, end quote. Stalin. Similarly, Stalin spoke of the contradictions between labor and capital, between the ruling and the colonial nations, between the financial groups in the capitalist countries, and between the imperialist powers in their struggle for the sources of raw materials. Footnote: Stalin, Foundations of Leninism. This is the sense in which Marx and sometimes Engels too use the expression, quote, contradiction, end quote. For example, in German Ideology and in Anti-Düring. When Marx spoke of the contradiction between the productive forces and the relations of production, Marx referred in metaphysical form to the conflicts between classes, battles of ideas or political struggles arising in a definite state of society from the imbalance between the productive forces and the relations of production. Marx never thought of any real contradiction, sensu stricto, inherent in this state of society which actually produces conflicts, battles, or struggles. End footnote. Merely because correlative terms can be applied simultaneously to a material object does not imply that an internal contradiction has been disclosed in it. An object may not be homogeneous in some respect, be composed of mutually opposed parts, reveal a polar structure or opposite tendencies, and thus be subject to an inner stress. The inner stress does not involve logical contradiction, and the description of the polar structure inherent in, quote, things and phenomena of nature, end quote, does not require the abandonment of the principle of non-contradiction. Stalin needed the polar struggle and inner stress present in all natural objects to transform the Heraclitean and Hegelian metaphor of the struggle of opposites into a cosmological principle. Stalin followed faithfully in Lenin's footsteps and maintained that the struggle of opposites explain the origin of motion and thus make it possible to dispense with the Aristotelian axiom, quote, whatever moves is moved by something else, end quote. The inner stress is assumed to produce conditions in which change occurs spontaneously, that is, from within a given object, and, consequently, an external efficient causation may be replaced by an intrinsic efficient causation. an intrinsic efficient causation. Things have an internal source of change and motion, an activity of things' own inherent in them. Change, motion, and development are instances of the self-movement of matter and of self-moving nature. They result from a, quote, disclosure of the contradictions inherent in things and phenomena, end quote. As for a, quote, struggle, end quote, of opposite tendencies, end quote, which operate on the basis of these contradictions and which constitute the, quote, internal content, end quote, of evolutionary and progressive advance. Stalin's pronouncements on the spontaneity of change and development are scraps of the doctrine of Engels and Lenin, who opposed, quote, mechanistic causality, end quote, and laid stress on the inner spontaneous and self-sustaining activity of things. In the case of Engels and Lenin, their return to the ideas of the Greek hylozoist philosophers concerning the self-movement of matter and the self-sufficiency of nature was prompted by Engels and Lenin's opposition to mechanistic materialism and by Engels and Lenin's concern with the claims of theology. According to Wikipedia, hylozoism is the philosophical doctrine according to which all matter is alive or animated, either in itself or as participating in the action of a superior principle, usually the world soul. The theory holds that matter is unified with life or spiritual activity. Hylozoism is a 17th century term formed from the Greek words hyle, parenthesis, wood, matter, and parenthesis, and zoe, quote, life, end quote, which was coined by the English Platonist philosopher Ralph Cudworth in 1678. Back to the text. In the case of Engels and Lenin, their return to the ideas of the Greek hylozoist philosophers concerning the self-movement of matter and the self-sufficiency of nature was prompted by Engels and Lenin's opposition to mechanistic materialism and by Engels and Lenin's concern with the claims of theology. Stalin's language and ideas on change and development are reminiscent of all these speculations, but Stalin's true purpose seems to be more pedestrian and closer to the realities of political life. For Stalin, the socio-cosmic principle of the struggle of opposites was indispensable, since it entailed the inevitability of the class struggle, and the inevitability of the class struggle made the policy of class domination an inexorable necessity. Footnote: Stalin was convinced on practical grounds that the construction of socialism required an increasing and not a decreasing use of power on the part of the state. Quote, a classless society, end quote, Stalin told the 17th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party in 1934, quote, cannot come of its own accord, end quote. It had to be built, of course, by the efforts of all working people, but these efforts would come to naught if these efforts were not supported by, quote, strengthening the organs of the dictatorship of the proletariat, by eliminating the remnants of the capitalist class in battles with enemies both internal and external, end quote. Stalin. Generally speaking, Stalin showed no interest in the laws of dialectics. End footnote. Generally speaking, Stalin showed no interest in the laws of dialectics, which Stalin presented as cosmological laws of the highest generality, unless the laws of dialectic significance and specific function in the social and political sphere were directly and plainly visible. New section. Section 3. Stalin as philosopher. Philosophy in the Socratic sense is a way of life which is characterized by devotion to truth and love of wisdom. Philosophy in a more pedestrian sense means submission to an intellectual discipline, the acceptance of logical rules and factual evidence which enables others to ask questions, raise objections, and carry further on the investigation of the subject of inquiry. A man who does not comply with these requirements is clearly not a philosopher. That it is hardly possible to treat Stalin as a genuine philosopher according to either of these definitions is a widely accepted view outside of the Soviet Union. Try as one may, it is impossible to discover in the dialectical materialism of Stalin either the originality and profundity of thought with which Stalin is credited in the USSR, or intellectual acumen and professional competence. Stalin's doctrine is an eclectic composition which freely borrows ideas, definitions, and even whole formulations from Engels and above all from Lenin. The fallacies taken over from Stalin's predecessors remain undisclosed, and their ideas are further simplified in order to serve the requirements of social and political life. Quote, Marxism had, in fact, shortened the distance between politics, philosophy, and literature, end quote, wrote Stalin's biographer. Quote, Stalin crudely simplified the Marxist view of their interconnection until Stalin degraded science, history, and art to the point where they became handmaidens of Stalin's politics, end quote. And that's a quote from Isaac Deutscher, actually. Footnote, the unfavorable evaluation of Stalin as a philosopher is not inconsistent with the opinion discussed and endorsed in the opening paragraph of this chapter that Stalin should not be banned from the annals of contemporary philosophy. End footnote. Stalin's gift of lucid exposition did not save Stalin from obvious errors and palpable absurdities, due to his unfamiliarity with the problems which he examined. Stalin had only a second-hand, sketchy knowledge both of the philosophy of Hegel and that of Feuerbach. But Stalin did not hesitate to write on the relations between the philosophy of Hegel, Feuerbach, and Marx. Stalin tinkered with the intricate problems of the psychology and philosophy of language, and with those of the theory of knowledge in which he was not at home. Stalin had difficulties in differentiating between the intension and extension of a term and between a word and the word's referent, and consequently was inclined to consider language as a system of symbols with the power of creating, altering, or destroying the world of real objects. Footnote. See Leitis' piece, Stalin as an Intellectual. End footnote. Stalin discussed materialism and idealism at length without realizing the variety of meanings in which these terms are used and in which Stalin himself actually used these terms. Stalin held firm opinions as to how history and sociology should be studied, but was a complete stranger to both. His entire intellectual baggage was the knowledge of Lenin and of Marx and Engels in Lenin's interpretation. Under these circumstances, it is no wonder that he espoused an inconsistent system of crude metaphysics and was responsible for many primitive fallacies. Stalin was unaware of the fact that scientific statements are something more than mere general affirmations, and that the pursuit of generalities was bound to lead Stalin to vague and illusory conclusions. Having little understanding of the philosophical problems involved, Stalin relied on mere assertions or oracular pronouncements rather than on analysis and argument. If these assertions and pronouncements happen to be true, it is only by accident, for there is no proof of their correctness. Since they have not been established on a sound scientific basis, these assertions and pronouncements are at best plausible guesses. Stalin did not intend to persuade others about the truth of Stalin's beliefs. Stalin was satisfied to state his beliefs dogmatically and to have them believed on his authority. Stalin simply taught that everybody ought to hold what everybody ought to hold. Stalin simply taught what everybody ought to hold to be true. Stalin's Dialectical and Historical Materialism, the piece, provides no evidence that Stalin was genuinely interested in materialist philosophy for its own sake. What Stalin was clearly anxious to achieve was to establish the belief that historical materialism was an inference rigorously derived from philosophical materialism, and that historical materialism entailed a number of consequences, all of which supported the policies of the Soviet state. It was from this point of view that Stalin dealt with the question of what the principal features of philosophical materialism were and what particular content should be given to the doctrine of historical materialism. Stalin was anxious to show above all that far from being arbitrary, his policies were formed in accordance with the laws of the universe and supported, as it were, by cosmic decrees. The extreme simplification of dialectical materialism in Stalin's exposition was due to the priority given to practical and political implications over theoretical considerations. Since dialectical materialism was the cornerstone and the foundation of the world outlook of a political mass movement, Stalin reduced it to a handful of simple beliefs which in his opinion could be understood by everybody and be used to derive rules of action and effective policies in social and political affairs. Stalin's simplifying and selective approach to the materialist tradition was also prompted by Stalin's determination to secure strict control over all manifestations of intellectual life, including natural science and philosophy, as well as over the behavior of the people at large. Stalin aspired towards intellectual leadership of scientists, scholars, philosophers, men of art and letters, and at the same time was anxious to replace the old philosophy that was an exclusive preserve of a small elite and intellectual aristocracy, by the new one no longer, quote, detached from life and alien to the people, end quote. Zhdanov told the philosophers in 1947 that the establishment of the party's command on the philosophical front was to arm the people with the, quote, consciousness of the correctness of our path and with scientifically grounded confidence in the ultimate victory of our cause, end quote. Zhdanov. That's from A. Zhdanov's book On Literature, Music, and Philosophy. The requirements of total control over the minds of scientists, scholars, and philosophers were reflected in various doctrinal changes, but their impact is perhaps most apparent in Stalin's abandonment of Lenin's doctrine concerning the dual concept of matter. It should be remembered that Lenin distinguished between the philosophical and scientific concept of matter in order to strengthen the materialist standpoint against the criticism based on the discoveries in physics which seem to support the tendency in modern science to describe the laws and order in the universe in the language of idealism. Stalin took no notice of this controversy and recognized only one concept of matter, namely the philosophical. The concept of matter explained the authors of the textbook Dialectical Materialism, edited by G.F. Alexandrov, in their presentation of Stalin's philosophical materialism, should connote only the most general properties of objective reality and should not include any characteristics discovered in a particular form of matter in motion. Wikipedia says Georgi Alexandrov lived from 1908 to 1961 and was a Marxist philosopher and Soviet politician. Where am I? I'll see if there's anything else for G.F. Alexandrov, but there's not. So back to the text. The concept of matter explained the authors of the textbook Dialectical Materialism, edited by G.F. Alexandrov, in the presentation of Stalin's philosophical materialism, should connote only the most general properties of objective reality, and should not include any characteristics discovered in a particular form of matter in motion. Therefore, there does not and cannot exist a, quote, natural scientific or, quote, physical, end quote, concept of matter distinct from the philosophic one. The abandonment by Stalin of Lenin's distinction was closely related to the controversy. The abandonment by Stalin of Lenin's distinction was closely related to the controversy between the Dvorinite and the mechanistic school of thought in Soviet philosophy, which was terminated by the formal condemnation of the mechanist and followed by a complete rout of the Dvorinites by the Soviet Communist Party. Footnote. The description of the defeat of the two schools in Soviet philosophy is based on D. Jurovsky, Soviet Marxism and Natural Science. End footnote. The original point at issue between the two groups was concerned, inter alia, with the question as to whether natural science should enjoy ideological neutrality and ideological autonomy. While the mechanists insisted that natural science should not be bound by metaphysical presuppositions, the Dvoranites demanded that it should accept its philosophical and methodological principles from Marxist-Leninist philosophy. In this controversy, the views of the mechanists were condemned by the temporarily victorious Dvoranites, supported by the Communist Party officials, who accused the mechanists of resisting the Marxist-Leninist ideology, of deviating from Marx, Engels, and Lenin, and of undermining the proletarian dictatorship in the fatherland of socialism. Then the Dvoranites were denounced and found to be guilty of a, quote, formalist deviation, end quote. That is, of the reluctance to recognize their subordination to the leadership of the Communist Party in matters of philosophy and ideology, as dialectical materialism is the world outlook of the Marxist-Leninist Party. The leadership of the party is its legitimate guardian and highest authority. The successive rout of the two schools of thought led to the establishment of a strict ideological party supervision over both natural science and philosophy, buttressed by the principle of partijnost in the most extreme interpretation. Not really saying anything for this, but it says partijnost means like party-mindedness or partisanship. Yeah, it means like partisanship when you put it through the translator from English to Russian. The successive rout of the two schools of thought led to the establishment of a strict ideological party supervision over both natural science and philosophy, buttressed by the principle of partijnost in its most extreme interpretation. In the Stalinist period, the principle of partijnost was no longer restricted to the recognition of the two principal alignments in philosophy, from which Lenin deduced the demand for, quote, consistent adherence to materialism, end quote. Stalin demanded, quote, militant partisanship, end quote, based on the understanding that, quote, Marxist philosophy is the most complete and most decisive negation of all preceding philosophy, end quote. That Marxist philosophy superseded all philosophical schools and that it became a, quote, scientific weapon in the hands of the proletarian masses, end quote. Zhdanov. Consequently, partijnost, conceived as a mere consistent adherence to materialism, was no longer sufficient. Partijnost meant the unconditional submission to what the party leadership declared to be true in each particular case, and required the recognition of the principle that though individuals may err, the party was infallible. Stalin's principle of partijnost also implied the belief in the necessary relationship between philosophical tendencies and political views, between philosophical schools and political parties. Expressed in practical terms, the Stalinist principle of partijnost implied that, quote, every political deviation had philosophical roots, every philosophical deviation political offshoots, while philosophical orthodoxy was to be found in the correct party line and only there, end quote. D. Jurovsky, Soviet Marxism and Natural Science. Consequently, philosophical controversies became theological rather than philosophical disputes. The point at issue was no longer the discovery of truth, but the establishment of the line of division between orthodoxy and heresy. The content of orthodoxy could not be described by enumerating its accepted views. It could only be indicated by the name of an office or an authority, with which it was entrusted or deposited. Footnote. For details, see Z.A. Jordan's, the author of this book that I'm reading, Z.A. Jordan's essay or article, The Philosophical Background of Revisionism in Poland. Orthodoxy can be defined in this context as the support given to a doctrine which serves the interest of an organization and which substitutes the loyalty to an organization for the loyalty to truth. On the other hand, heresy results from an intellectual attitude which prompts the search for what is true, irrespective of its effect for the interest of an organization or for the power and prestige of those in control of this organization. End footnote. Dialectical and Historical Materialism by Stalin was published after the establishment of the supremacy of the party over natural science and philosophy, and Stalin's abandonment of the two concepts of matter should be seen in connection with this development of events. The abolition of Lenin's distinction helped in the service of The abolition of Lenin's distinction helped in the exercise of the ideological and methodological supervision of the party over scientists, scholars, and philosophers, and in the imposition of, quote, the correct line of inquiry, end quote, upon all of them. As long as it was possible to argue that the concept of matter had not only a philosophical but a scientific meaning as well, the door of escape from the party's ideological tutelage remained open, and Marxist philosophical materialism could be interpreted in various ways. According to Stalin, this also meant that different political implications could be derived from the assumptions of philosophical materialism. Socialism would thus no longer be scientific in the sense that its program of action and policies could be rigorously obtained by inference from the cosmic principles. Since the distinction between the two concepts of matter might have all these unforeseeable and undesirable consequences, it had to be eliminated altogether. As a Soviet philosopher put it, quote, the notion of a dual concept of matter implies a divorcement of dialectical materialism from the living process of inquiry into nature and leads to a dissolution of the creative force and guiding role of Marxist-Leninist philosophy in gaining knowledge of the world, end quote. I'm not sure who that is from, but it was quoted by Vetter. Where am I? The instrumentalist approach to the problems of philosophy and their revision in the light of practical and political requirements makes of dialectical and historical materialism, or Marxism and problems of linguistics, a sociological and political document rather than a philosophical essay. This evaluation should surprise nobody. Stalin himself repeatedly stated that, like Lenin, Stalin saw no use in theoretical thinking unless theory was able to, quote, serve practice, end quote. If a theory did not help to answer questions raised by practical requirements, it was good for nothing. To value a theory because it may be used as a, quote, guide to action, end quote, is one thing, but to believe that the theory is of no value except as a, quote, guide to action, end quote, is quite another. The latter view, which reduces the function of knowledge to knowledge's social and political usefulness, is a particular version of the instrumentalist conception of knowledge. Stalin's instrumentalism can best be understood as part of Stalin's voluntaristic interpretation of the Marxian doctrine to be considered in the next section. Section Sorry. 1 second. Where am I? I scrolled down and then I don't think I scrolled down too far. Come on, you bastard. Section 4. The voluntarism and instrumentalism of Stalin. Marx never was nor wished to be a scholar detached from reality, motivated exclusively by theoretical curiosity. In Marx's youthful examination of Hegel's system, Marx pointed out that philosophy failed to solve many of its problems precisely because their solution was a matter of real life, and philosophy saw in them purely theoretical questions. Alienation and religion provided the best instances of problems of this sort. Alienation of the wage worker who sells his labor power to the capitalist entrepreneur is not merely a philosophical concept that can be used for the analysis of social relations. Although alienation might be exposed by intellectual means, alienation will not disappear unless alienation is abolished by social action. In the same manner, the critique of religion that shows religion to be an inverted mirror image of social reality cannot be fully successful until the social conditions reflected in religion are entirely changed, that is, until the oppressed classes are emancipated from the slavery which they endure in modern society. Quote, the call, bracket, to men, end bracket, to abandon their illusion about their condition is a call to abandon a condition which requires illusions, end quote. A philosophy useful in its application must grow out of actual social needs and tensions. Marx became convinced that it was the task of the philosopher to clarify the ideas of men about the social conflicts of their own day, and not only to formulate a demand for their resolution, but also to make this demand effective. Whenever a problem had both a theoretical and practical aspect, it was sheer intellectual hypocrisy to ignore the latter, and to act as if the former constituted the sole matter worthy of consideration. It was this hypocritical pretense on the part of the young Hegelians, who did not take account of philosophy as part of German reality, that aroused Marx's withering anger against their extravagant and abstract literary production. While Marx himself never deviated from the view that only if we know a situation can we deal with its problems, Marx was painfully aware of the pressure and urgency of practical considerations. Marx was anxious not only to enlighten men about their social conditions, but also to help men conquer their poverty and misery. Early in life, Marx made the famous statement that it was the task of the philosopher not only to interpret the world, but to also change the world. Marx did not make this statement in order to depreciate the importance and significance of knowledge. In Marx's opinion, there was a close and essential relationship between action and knowledge. Knowledge was a necessary condition of effective action, and action was conducive to the advancement of knowledge. The will to change the world stimulates inventiveness and suggests new ways of inquiry. But the famous statement did mean that knowledge had both a cognitive purpose and a social function. Marx's admiration for Francis Bacon seemed largely from Bacon's vision of the future when science was to become a socially revolutionary force, the foundation of action directed to the advantage of human well-being and happiness. Science, Marx argued against Proudhon, should not be reduced to, quote, the slender proportions of a scientific formula, end quote. That is, the instrumentalist aspect of science, apparent in its power of revolutionizing reality, should never be overlooked. In his own work, Marx accomplished what he demanded of others. In his review of a contribution to the critique of political economy, Engels pointed out that the materialist conception of history was, quote, a revolutionary discovery, end quote, which ran counter to all traditional ways of thinking in the historical sciences. But the materialist conception, Engels added, involved highly revolutionary consequences, and not only for theory, but also for practice. Quote, As we pursue our materialist thesis further and apply it to the present, the perspective of a tremendous revolution, indeed the most tremendous revolution of all time, unfolds itself before us." End quote. Engels. Marx believed that natural science penetrates into human life through its transformation of industry and social relations, even though natural science's immediate effect may increase the dehumanization of man. Even though the application of natural science's immediate effect may increase the dehumanization of man, the applications of natural science prepare the ultimate emancipation of humanity. "Scientific work is a social act," wrote Marx in Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844. Marx wished thereby to make a sociological statement and to emphasize that all human activity is actually, if not manifestly, social in human activity's origin. To press this view home, Marx pointed out that even scientific work, which is only rarely carried out in association with others, is essentially a social act, impossible to perform outside society. Marx's sociological statement also had some moral implications. Quote, "When I carry out scientific work, I produce for society and with the consciousness of acting as a social being." End quote. Marx. Paul Lafargue, his son-in-law, remembered Marx saying that, quote, "Science could not be an egoistic pleasure," end quote, and that its first and foremost task was the application of knowledge in the service of humanity. Footnote, quoted in Tom Baltimore and Maximilien Rubel in the introduction to Karl Marx, Selected Writings in Sociology and Social Philosophy, which I believe was the first book I read containing Marx's texts when I was a younger man. Marx, together with Comte, supported the view that science and philosophy had a social role to play and a social obligation to carry out. However, they both recognized that before science and philosophy can serve man, man must first be known. Knowledge necessarily precedes social, moral, and political change. Knowledge and practical activity have to be kept apart, for truth is to be discovered and not made by successful action. All science is based on experience. Quote, "Die Wissenschaft ist Erfahrungswissenschaft." End quote. Quote, and quote, "Science consists in applying a rational method of investigation to the data provided by the senses." End quote. Induction, analysis, comparison, observation, and experiment are the principal forms of such a rational method. To act effectively, we must be able to choose what, on the basis of evidence, is the most suitable means for achieving a desired end. But to select appropriate means is to make use of a rational method, that is, the method of science. Marx clearly differentiated socialism as a stage in social evolution on the one hand, and a political movement or intellectual trend on the other, from its, quote, "real basis," end quote. His new social science, which could be established only by empirical study of social facts, the comparative analysis of historical development, and the elaboration of a theoretical framework for the investigation of social systems and social change. Effective action depends on the rational choice of the most suitable and best means to desired ends. It also depends on the knowledge of the social and economic conditions under which action is to be accomplished. Effective action, which really succeeds in solving a practical problem, is determined by the, quote, "life situation," end quote, of the doer and by the structure of the larger society. We cannot produce social change of the desired kind unless we take advantage of the new science of man, which investigates the whole advance of civilization as the creation of man accomplished through man's own efforts. The subordination of this power of self-creation to rational self-direction cannot succeed but on the basis of experience and knowledge which enables us to establish true conclusions about the existing situation and the rationality of means. The alternative to the scientific mode of thought is the utopian, based on the belief that in the absence of appropriate social and economic conditions, ideas alone can conquer the world by virtue of their own power. Although through no fault of their own, the utopians were supporters of the view that action can dispense with knowledge and become a guide to theory, they dealt only with the problem of the rationality of means and ignored the question of the existing situation, in relation to which the rationality of means should be considered and assessed. Since the utopians assumed that the new social situation can be created and social organization contrived by their inventive action, the utopians produced only, quote, innocent and childlike fancies, end quote, or, quote, phantoms, end quote. That is, knowledge distorted by, quote, the ideological reflexes and echoes, end quote, of man's conditions in social life. Marx recognized both the requirements of knowledge and those of action, and did not wish to expand one at the expense of the other. Neither Lenin nor Stalin remained faithful to this Marxian inheritance. Both were men of action first and foremost, unappreciative of and impatient with the procedures by which knowledge is acquired. It is quite different, Lenin said, to be interested in, quote, Marxism as a theory, end quote, and to consider Marxism, quote, as an answer to the question, quote, what is to be done, end quote, as a call to take the field against the enemy, end quote. Lenin, what is to be done? For Lenin, and still more for Stalin, truth was to be made, not discovered. Lenin and Stalin felt that Lenin and Stalin had the power to change the whole world by Lenin and Stalin's revolutionary will and activity. In order to be truly in control of the course of events, the conditions of action have to be assessed critically, the defects of spontaneity laid bare, and spontaneity itself elevated to the level of consciousness. This implied, according to Lenin, that, quote, the, quote, ideologist, end quote, is worthy of the name only when he precedes the spontaneous movement, points out the road, and is able to head off all others to solve all the theoretical, political, tactical, and organizational questions which, quote, the material elements, end quote, of the movement spontaneously encounter, end quote. Lenin, a talk with defenders of economism. Lenin and Stalin were absolutely sure that Lenin and Stalin were in possession of an important insight into the mechanism of effective social and political action, which Lenin and Stalin would reveal and demonstrate by acting upon and changing the world. Lenin and Stalin maintained by implication that the conformity of thought to reality was to be achieved in the course of changing the world and by actual mastery over the world. This meant, however, that the provisionality and tentativeness of the Marxian beliefs, which in their application to practical exegesis left room for alternative possibilities of action, had to be replaced by a compelling certainty and a set of final and unconditional postulates based on one alternative to the exclusion of others. The efficiency of action not only required that the claims of alternative views be disregarded, but also that doubt be suppressed, and the working assumption be transformed into an absolute principle, actively supported by the whole weight of authority. When the striving after an impartial view is abandoned, and the principles of action become an incontrovertible truth, they are bound to breed intolerance, repressive measures, and finally suppression and persecution. He who dissents from what we hold to be true is only an error, but he who dissents from absolute truth provides conclusive proof of his evil and corrupted will. For Lenin, and still more so for Stalin, the Marxian theory of history and society became an instrument which could and should be used for the purpose of intervening in the course of social events and in the historical process. As Lenin put it, the revolutionary quality, quote, is indeed completely and unconditionally inherent in Marxism, for this theory sets itself the task of ... serving the proletariat as a means of ending all exploitation as quickly and easily as possible. End quote. Lenin. In the celebrated introduction to a contribution to the critique of political economy, Marx spoke of how socialism was bound to emerge from the process of social and economic development of the capitalist society, the advance towards socialism being independent of human intention, will, or active design. Stalin took the very opposite view. The old does not grow automatically into the new. The advance towards socialism is not a spontaneous process, but one dependent on deliberate action, such as the strengthening of the organs of the dictatorship of the proletariat or the intensification of the class struggle. Stalin announced that, at least in the Soviet Union, quote, so-called objective conditions, end quote, as Stalin put it, had practically ceased to count. Quote, the part played by so-called objective conditions has been reduced to a minimum, whereas the part played by our organization and our organization's leaders has become decisive, exceptional, end quote. The laying down of, quote, the correct political line, end quote, the effectiveness of planning, the organizational and supervisory work, the quality of leadership, and human skill and determination, quote, decide everything, end quote. Stalin, report to the 17th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolsheviks. When Marxian teaching was reduced to a set of organizational, tactical, and strategical directives of how to remake social and historical existence, its practical and instrumental aspect was bound to predominate over and finally absorb its theoretical and cognitive content. The interpretation of the Marxian doctrine will be called, quote, this interpretation of the Marxian doctrine will be called, quote, voluntarism, end quote, or the, quote, voluntaristic interpretation of the Marxian doctrine, end quote. For this interpretation involves the belief that the will is the inner and true nature of man, and intellect is a mere tool of the will. Expressed in more cautious terms, voluntarism asserts the primacy of the will over the intellect and over material conditions which are regarded as merely phenomenal appearance. As Schopenhauer put it, the intellect is as different from the will as the hammer from the smith. Quote, will shows itself as of a nature quite different from knowledge, which only serves it for communication with the external world. But then the will follows the laws of its own nature, without taking from the intellect anything but the occasion, end quote. Stalin was not the first to use a theory formulated for the purpose of explaining the course of events to urge and justify certain practical policies. John Dewey observed that in this respect, quote, Marxism, end quote, was preceded by a number of non-Marxian social philosophies, which John Dewey criticized for their entirely mistaken conception of the relation between social theory and social action. In particular, according to John Dewey, they made the false assumption that a social issue does not concern a choice of values to be striven for, but is concerned with the discovery of ends and means determined by the constitution of human nature. Thus, the classical school of economic theory discovered that self-interest was the main human motive force and agitated for a free market economy and for the appropriate legal and political measures which were to safeguard the free market system. Similarly, utilitarianism took advantage of the principle that pleasure and pain are the main determinants of human behavior to advocate a comprehensive plan for social reform that would secure the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Dewey believed that such theories were bound to produce both serious social ills and errors of judgment because they dealt with human motivations in a, quote, wholesale way, end quote, appealed to general forces, obscured the need for observation, and created an illusion of understanding where there is only a general word and a phrase. Apart from their similarity, however, the instrumentalism of Stalin and the classic school of economic theory or utilitarianism are divided by an important difference. The latter theories did not claim that their premises and ways of viewing the world presented the total and absolute truth. While they provided a general framework for the examination of social, political, and economic events, the working assumptions derived from the theories in question were formulated tentatively as specific hypotheses which should be submitted to practical tests. In other words, they were, quote, piecemeal social experiments, end quote, which, unlike the experiments of large-scale or total social engineering, can be carried out without revolutionizing the whole of society. There's a footnote here, and I'm betting I can't see it, just to prove how smart I am. I'm pretty sure this footnote will be in reference to Karl Popper. Let's see. Drumroll. For the distinction between the two types of social engineering, see Popper, Open Society, Volume 1. End footnote. Stalin did not accept any of these restraints and limitations. Having conceived his rules of action as universally valid and applicable, Stalin claimed to know what was the most appropriate way of dealing with any problem before he had considered it. Stalin did not formulate specific hypotheses which could be tested practically, but resorted to the sweeping measures of total engineering, which involved the whole of society. Since the sociological knowledge necessary for large-scale social and technology was not available, and the theory did not in fact provide the guidance it was supposed to offer, the alleged, quote, practical deductions, end quote, for theoretical assumptions had to be made arbitrarily. Absolutism in theory leads inevitably to arbitrariness in practice, observed Comte, examining the conditions which a theory should satisfy in order that it may be suitable for practical application. Although Stalin might have claimed to act in conformity to the theory, it was Stalin himself who determined what was or was not in conformity to the theory. Ultimately, it was not the theory which determined what should be done in practical terms. The will of the leader decided what the theory should imply. The voluntarism of Stalin should not be contrasted with the alleged fatalism of Marx, which indeed seems to be incompatible with his revolutionary activity and certain important parts of his doctrine. The contrast should be located at a different level and expressed in other terms than those of the antithesis between fatalism and voluntarism. To say that Marx relied, quote, solely and exclusively, end quote, as Engels put it, upon the intellectual development and united action of the working class for the ultimate triumph of the ideas of the Communist Manifesto, is a clear misinterpretation of his views. But the opposite opinion, namely that Marx proclaimed the absolute impotence of politics, as equally untenable. Footnote. This view is to be found in Popper, Open Society, Volume 2. It might be interesting to note that Marx was charged with considering political action futile by Karl Heinzen in Deutsche Brüsseler Zeitung in 1847, where Marx and Engels' replies to this charge were also published. End footnote. Marx did not adhere to the view that political action was never bringing about a decisive change in the economic and social situation. Marx did not adhere to the view that political action can never bring about a decisive change in the economic and social situation. Complete abstention from political movement and the belief in the futility of all politics was the dogma of Bakunin and followers of Proudhon, who constituted a real and deep difference between Marx's ideas and anarchism. Lenin did not depart from the spirit of Marxian teaching when Lenin said that from its viewpoint, quote, the negation of politics, end quote, was an absurdity, and that for Marx the economic and political struggle of the working class constituted a single inseparable whole. Footnote. See Lenin, A Protest by Russian Social Democrats and in his collected works, and Anarchism and Socialism. Marx stated explicitly that political action could, under favorable circumstances, alter the course of social and economic development. An instance of this was the successful struggle of the English workers to secure the passage of the 10 Hours Bill, which brought them in Marx's own words, quote, immense physical, moral, and intellectual benefits, end quote. Footnote. See Marx's inaugural address of the Working Men's International Association. Parenthesis, this particular passage has sometimes been misread completely, end parenthesis. Engels also commented favorably on the 10 Hours Bill as well as on the success of the French, German, and English workers in the parliamentary elections and considered these developments as important stages in the emancipation of the working class. Neither Marx nor Engels did in fact endorse the doctrine of the impotence of politics. End footnote. If Marx had not believed in the efficacy of political action, Marx would not have appealed to the workers to, quote, put their heads together as a class and as a class compel the passing of a law, that shall prevent the very workers from selling, by voluntary contract with capital, themselves and their families into slavery and death, end quote. Marx's Capital. Politics is a rational application of force, but the force itself is an economic power, as Marx pointed out in Capital, which in certain conditions might hasten the process of transformation or shorten the transition from one mode of production to another. Marx refused to differentiate between social and political revolutions. Quote, every revolution breaks up the old society, and to this extent, every revolution is social, end quote. Marx argued against Arnold's Ruga, quote, every revolution overthrows the existing ruling power. To this extent, it is political, end quote. More generally, social and political movements do not exclude each other. Quote, there is no political movement which is not at the same time social, end quote. Engels emphatically pointed out that Marx did not regard all political action as ineffective. One only has to look, Engels wrote, at the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte and Capital, at the chapters dealing with the working day or the history of the bourgeoisie, to see that Marx did not consider political power economically impotent and political struggle futile. Why should we fight for the political dictatorship of the proletariat, Engels asked, if political power is powerless as economic force? What Marx did denounce was political action which ignored the economic and social circumstances, or did not recognize its general dependence upon economic conditions, or aimed solely at, quote, administrative reforms, end quote, which did not change the basic relations between capital and labor. Marx also heaped scorn and ridicule upon so-called utopian thinkers, naive moral preachers, or idealistic reformers, for believing that benevolent action could remedy the evils of capitalist society or help the underprivileged and exploited. Marx did not wish to laugh out of court every kind of political action, but only that which willfully disregarded the hard and stubborn facts of the class struggle or took no notice of the economic and social limitations inherent in every situation and restrictive of the effectiveness of action. Marx's views concerning the efficacy and significance of political action can be described as the doctrine of the relative impotence of politics. Marx attributed to politics a low degree of effectiveness incomparably lower than that accorded either to the improvement in the productivity of the economic forces or to the changes in the system of class relationships, together with its legal, political, and political superstructure. Quote, the principle of politics is the will, end quote, wrote Marx, and added, as if wishing to refute his Russian followers in the 20th century, quote, the more partial and the more perfected political thought becomes, the more political thought believes in the omnipotence of the will, the less able it is able to see the natural and mental limitations on the will, the less capable it is of discovering the source of social evils, end quote. Marx. To build a new world for themselves, men have to build on the historical accomplishments of their civilizations. Men have to work to establish the material conditions of their emancipation, which are the product of a long and painful process of development, and, quote, no effort of mind or will can free them from this destiny, end quote. The period of gestation and the birth pangs can be shortened or lessened by human intervention, but they cannot be done away with by ingenuity and the exaltation of the will. The voluntarism of Stalin did not arise from the opposition to the belief that political action was not necessary to bring about socialism, but from the rejection of a quite different view. Stalin refused to recognize the existence of economic restrictions and social limitations upon the effectiveness or relevance of action, and proclaimed them to be non-existent, at least in the Soviet Union. Thus Stalin also admitted by implication that everything was feasible and could be attained by skillful effort and unflagged determination. He just asserted what Marx denied, namely the omnipotence of the will. Footnote. See Nikolai Bukharin, Historical Materialism, where in the spirit of Marx, Bukharin argued against Stalin that no power is unlimited and no force can transcend that force's own bounds, and reached the conclusion that, quote, the alteration in the economic conditions that may be attained with the aid of the political lever is itself dependent on the previous state of the economic conditions, end quote. Nikolai Bukharin, end footnote. For Stalin, force was no longer the midwife, force was the mother of the new society. Stalin's determination to establish a rigorous control over social and historical processes resulted in Stalin's obsessive preoccupation with the problems of power. This preoccupation could only accentuate his disregard for ideas unless those ideas were able to take hold of the masses and mobilize the masses for action. Like Lenin, Stalin was never weary of repeating Marx's dictum to the effect that the theory which gets hold of the minds of the people turns into a material force. Their frequent tributes to ideas has secured them the reputation of men of action, who understood the importance of philosophy and from whom many idealist opponents of dialectical materialism could learn respect for thought. In fact, the pronouncements of Lenin and Stalin meant exactly the opposite, the utter disregard of thought, which only acquired importance as a means of social control or by degenerating into the art of propaganda. Furthermore, according to Lenin's conception of the party of the proletariat, fully endorsed by Stalin, no theory can take hold of the masses without being adopted by the party, the vanguard of the working class, which in its organization and program incarnates the class consciousness of the proletariat. By themselves, ideas are powerless. It is the party, therefore, which in the last resort is a history-making force, and to which everything else should be subordinated. The original Marxian theory of history and society did not require any political strategy or tactics on the part of its supporters. Footnote. For a contrary opinion, see Werner Sombart, Der proletarische Sozialismus. End footnote. The need for strategy and tactics arose only from the voluntaristic interpretation of the Marxian doctrine. The interpretation reduced Marxian theories to a collection of rules and techniques on how to control social processes by the application of power, and to use Stalin's expression, to change society by, quote, a revolution from above, end quote. This had nothing to do with the fact that Marx was no political theorist, and that he had nothing to say, as Lenin was to discover, about the use of political power. For Lenin and Stalin, the Marxian theory of history was not so much a scheme of historical development, but rather the consciousness of the inevitable transformation of capitalism into socialism, the determination to achieve it by whatever means might be available, and as quickly as possible, and the reliance upon the class struggle as a method of solving historical and social problems. See A.G. Meyer, Leninism. Since Marx Marx's cognitive theory of history and society was transformed by Lenin and Stalin into a manipulative theory, political strategy and tactics became its integral part and acquired crucial importance. Together with the recognition of the need for strategy and tactics, with the increasing confidence in the effectiveness of propaganda, large-scale organization, and all forms of control over men's overt and latent behavior as a means of solving perennial social problems, Lenin firmly adopted the assumption that without deliberately organized and correctly led action, the revolution would neither come to pass nor socialism be constructed. Footnote. A.G. Meyer argues that the need of strategy and tactics arose together with Lenin's loss of faith in the imminent breakdowns of capitalism and in the spontaneous revolutionary development of the working classes. The seeds of Leninism should therefore be sought in Lenin's pessimism about the inevitable advent of socialism. End footnote. With the interpretation of the Marxian doctrine as, quote, a call to take the field against the enemy, end quote, there was associated the view that it was, as Lenin put it, quote, our primary and imperative practical task to establish an organization of revolutionaries capable of lending energy, stability, and continuity to the political struggle, end quote. Paraphrasing the well-known dictum of Archimedes, Lenin called out in What is to be Done, quote, give us an organization of revolutionaries and we will overturn Russia, end quote. Lenin, What is to be Done? Stalin recognized the connection between a manipulative theory of history and society and the need for a political strategy and tactics with striking clear-sightedness at the very beginning of Stalin's rise to supreme power after Lenin's death. Quote, what in the last analysis is Leninism, end quote, asked Stalin in The Foundation of Leninism. Quote, Leninism is Marxism of the era of imperialism and the proletarian revolution. To be more exact, Leninism is the theory and tactics of the proletarian revolution in general, the theory and tactics of the dictatorship of the proletariat in particular, end quote, Stalin. Stalin followed faithfully in Lenin's footsteps when Stalin dismissed the importance of the, quote, objective conditions, end quote, declared that the struggle and prestige of the party, of economic and other organizations, and of their leaders, quote, now determine everything or nearly everything, end quote, and announced that the responsibility for the success and failure in the construction of socialism rested, quote, on ourselves and on ourselves alone, end quote. Stalin, report to the 17th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Footnote. H.B. Mayo provides no evidence in support of his sweeping assertion in Introduction to Marxist Theory that Marx and Engels would have had no quarrel with Lenin's views about the necessity of bringing class consciousness to the working class, quote, from without, for they held much the same sentiments, end quote. The point to be stressed is exactly the fundamental difference dividing Lenin from Marx in this respect. End footnote. Lenin's revolutionary Marxism did more than merely restore the revolutionary content to the Marxian theories, is not a new interpretation. Lenin's Russian opponents noticed at once that Lenin's distinctive interpretation of the Marxian doctrine, which became apparent in the columns of Iskra and reached its climax in What is to be Done, was associated with a pronounced, quote, sectarian intolerance, end quote, on Lenin's part and with the demand for an integral dogmatic outlook on life. Footnote. See Lenin's A Talk with Defenders of Economism. The view that the hardcore end footnote. The view that the hardcore of Leninism was the voluntaristic interpretation of the Marxian doctrine, and that Lenin should be held responsible for its transformation into mere rules of action, should be traced back to Plekhanov. Plekhanov charged Lenin with not recognizing any limits to social action. Bukharin made the same allegations against Stalin some 10 years later. in substituting the revolutionary will for the laws of history as the determinant of social and historical development. Footnote: see R.V. Daniels, The Fate and Will in the Marxian Philosophy of History. See also S.H. Barron's Plekhanov. For the references to Bukharin, see note 94 above. Lenin reciprocated Plekhanov's allegations and accused Plekhanov of, quote, hidden hypocrisy and shameful spinelessness, end quote, which compared unfavorably with the open hostility to revolution showed by its honest enemies. End footnote. Stalin attributed to Plekhanov the view that, quote, Leninism is the precedence of practice over theory in the sense that its main point is the translation of the Marxist thesis in deeds, and generally that Leninism is unconcerned about theory. Footnote: Stalin, Foundations of Leninism. This view of Leninism, Stalin wrote, bore no relation whatever to the truth. Lenin did not suffer from, quote, the disease of narrow empiricism or unprincipled practicalism, end quote, and was fully aware of the importance of theory for the proletarian movement. When faced by the objection that he had been inclined to belittle the significance of the objective factors of development, Lenin was taken aback and answered bewildered, quote, how may a designer of subjective plans belittle objective development, end quote. Lenin, what is to be done? Stalin showed as complete a lack of comprehension of what Plekhanov's criticism implied as Lenin had. The important point to be noted in the views of Lenin and Stalin concerning the role of theory and its relationship to practice is not the rejection of every theory or the denial of its utilitarian value, but the repudiation of its autonomous cognitive function. A theory, whether in science, philosophy, sociology, or politics, is nothing but an instrument of transforming nature, man, and society, a means in the hands of the party leadership to be used for the fulfillment of the great task assigned to it by history and destiny. Both Lenin and Stalin denied, either implicitly or explicitly, that scientific knowledge in general, and philosophy in particular, are governed by their own standards of procedure and criteria of truth or validity. Scientific knowledge and philosophy should be regarded as a social force. Scientific knowledge and philosophy are a collective endeavor. Scientific knowledge and philosophy owe their origin to social life, and they are determined in their context by the economic and technical evolution of society. As such, they can and should be used to shape social and political development. New section. Section 5. The equivocation of the concept of cause and the abandonment of voluntarism. The idea of subjecting the creative power of the human mind to conscious direction, taking advantage of it for the attainment of some all-inclusive social ends, might have been suggested to Lenin and Stalin by Engels' marginal observations on how to transform social forces, quote, from master demons into willing servants, end quote. Engels' reflections on knowledge which might enable man to control his natural and social environment involved an equivocal use of the concept of cause, and this ambiguity greatly contributed to the adoption of the voluntaristic interpretation of the Marxian doctrine. On the other hand, the discovery of Engels' equivocation led to the abandonment of some of the extreme forms of voluntarism at a later stage. It was Engels who defined freedom as, quote, the control over ourselves and over external nature, a control founded on knowledge of natural necessity, end quote. Freedom, Engels explained in the same context, quote, means nothing but the capacity to make decisions with knowledge of the subject, end quote. What Engels called the, quote, ascent of man from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom, end quote, consisted in the increasing knowledge of natural and social laws and in making those natural and social laws work towards definite ends. In this way, the conditions of life are brought under man's control, the extraneous natural forces facing and dominating man as an alien blind power are mastered by man, and the natural and social causes which he sets consciously in motion have increasingly the intended effects. Man begins to conquer his destiny and even in an ever-growing measure to make his own history. Engels emphasized in Anti-Düring and elsewhere that in spite of the diminishing influence of unforeseen effects, a colossal discrepancy between the proposed aims and the results arrived at by deliberate efforts still existed, and that the uncontrolled forces were far more powerful than those set in motion according to plan. He attributed this discrepancy above all to the absence of a conscious organization of social production. Since production was not regulated in accordance with a settled plan, the prevailing conditions were bound, on the one hand, to generate a predominance of unforeseen effects in the most essential activity of man, with chain reaction consequences, as we would say today, throughout society, and bound to delay the progress of natural science on the other. Engels felt that once the control over social production is established, mankind will experience an advance in all branches of its activity before which, quote, everything preceding it will pale into insignificance. End quote. Lenin, Dialectics of Nature. Whereas Engels' conception of freedom might have been the source of the voluntarism of Lenin and Stalin, Engels should only partly be blamed for their excessive claims. For Engels did emphasize the obvious point, which they tended to overlook and for which they somewhat missed, that in order to make laws work towards desired ends, prior knowledge of these laws is necessary. It was, however, Engels' fault that he did not distinguish the two quite different meanings the word cause may have in the theoretical and applied sciences, whether the natural or the social sciences, and that he was even inclined to ignore the distinction when he noticed it. We say that event A is the cause and event B the effect. If we can produce A or prevent A from happening and thus control the occurrence or non-occurrence of B, in all such cases, A is the cause of B if A is either the necessary or the sufficient condition of B. The event denoted by the term, quote, cause, end quote, in the first meaning is always an event which under certain conditions may be produced or prevented, directly or indirectly, by a human agency. In such cases, the manipulations performed by men are a contributory factor in the occurrence of A, and only upon their intervention, if A occurs, B necessarily follows, in conformity to some natural laws. But not all events to which we refer as causes can thus be controlled by a human agency. We may say that event A is the cause and event B is the effect in the second meaning, in which the term, quote, cause, end quote, may be used if and only if A is both the necessary and sufficient condition of B. In other words, A is the cause of B in the second sense if A is the invariable conditional antecedent of B. It is never the case that B takes place in the absence of A, and if A happens, B happens too. We can do nothing about the causal relationship of the second kind, for the cause is supposed to be unconditional and the effect inevitably follows it. This does not appear to be the case with the causes in the first meaning of the term, which never produce their effects by themselves. Thus, our knowledge of the causal relationship between A and B might enable us to control B by producing or preventing A, but the knowledge of what is either the sufficient or the necessary condition of B does not suffice to control the occurrence of B, for we are not always able actually to produce or prevent A as we please. What is physically possible need not be technically feasible. For both these reasons, we can never be full masters of our physical and social environment. The power of mind, will, and action to create the conditions under which natural and social forces would work towards man-appointed ends is real but strictly limited. It was only towards the end of his life that Stalin discovered the two meanings the term, quote, cause, end quote, may have. Stalin belatedly conceded that there are processes in nature and society which take place independently of the will of man. Sometimes we can influence them, but this is not always the case. In many instances, even the knowledge of the respective natural laws leaves us powerless. Moreover, we have first to discover the laws, quote, to get to know the laws and master the laws, learn to apply the laws with full understanding, utilize the laws in the interest of society, and thus subjugate the laws, end quote, before we can avert or restrict their destructive effects and initiate or promote their constructive action. Where am I? This meant the retreat from the extreme forms of voluntarism and the recognition of its limitations. The, quote, laws of science, end quote, can neither be abolished nor altered, nor can new ones be created. It is technically or physically impossible to produce or prevent the occurrence of all causes, to manipulate the operation of all natural laws, to improve and enforce them upon man and society at will, and to bring everything under human control. As Stalin put it, the achievements of the Soviet government resulting from the application of science to social and economic problems did not imply that the Soviet government can, quote, do anything, end quote, and that, quote, nothing is beyond it, end quote. Footnote, that Stalin's acceptance of, quote, restraints and limitations upon action even under socialism, end quote, was due to Stalin's apprehension that otherwise Soviet planners would appear, quote, more responsible for chronic shortages than they really are, end quote. See Lights, Stalin is an Intellectual. Let me repeat that whole thing, I fucked it up. That Stalin's acceptance of, quote, restraints and limitations upon action, even under socialism, end quote, was due to his apprehension that otherwise Soviet planners would appear, quote, more responsible for chronic shortages than they really are, end quote, is a critical observation which scores a debating point rather than providing an explanation of the issues involved. For the voluntarist, quote, knowledge means, quote, knowledge of the adaptation to environment, end quote. And adaptation is conceived as a purposeful action intended to produce the desired kind of change in the environment. When the limits of man's mastery over his environment were recognized, adaptation had also to be considered as adjustment to extraneous and social conditions independent of the will of man and outside his control. Before Stalin reached this point of retreat, Stalin pushed the doctrine of man's mastery over social environment and of his unrestricted control over nature, of which his support of the theory of the inheritance of acquired characteristics is an extreme instance, to its uppermost limits and originates what is euphemistically known as the, quote, period of errors and distortions, end quote. It has frequently been observed that Stalin's policies were rooted in Stalin's determination to transform the Soviet Union into a modern industrial society as fast as possible, and that, therefore, Stalin's voluntarism was nothing but a rationalization of this drive. Whatever motives prompted Stalin to adopt the voluntaristic position, whether only to rationalize Stalin's prior decision whether only to rationalize Stalin's prior decision to enter upon a definite course of action, or to express Stalin's insight into the nature and activity of man, the voluntaristic outlook set a number of practical and theoretical problems. Of these problems, only those which led to significant revision of dialectical materialism will be considered. Section 6. Voluntarism and the sociomorphic conception of the universe. The fulcrum of Stalin's manipulative theory of history was historical materialism. For Engels, the materialist conception of history was a hypothesis or a point of view which was to be tested by accepted procedures like any other hypothesis or point of view adopted by historians. For Stalin, Engels' approach to historical materialism was unsatisfactory and unacceptable. Stalin did not wish to establish the validity of a theory of history. Stalin was anxious to make use of it as an instrument for transforming social reality in conformity to a preconceived scheme. What Stalin was in need of was a procedure that would persuade Stalin's followers of the reliability of the instrument he wished to use. The followers were to be induced to believe that as a matter of fact, quote, whatever are the conditions of material life of a society, such are the ideas, theories, political views, and political institutions of that society. End quote. Stalin, Dialectical and Historical Materialism. Lenin suggested that historical materialism is a particular case of genetic and epistemological materialism, and Stalin exploited this clue to the utmost. According to Stalin, whose views on this subject will be more closely examined in Part 3, historical materialism should be considered as conclusively established, for it can be rigorously derived from dialectical materialism. Once the truth of dialectical materialism is accepted, the materialist conception of history follows from it logically. One cannot accept the former and reject the latter. As dialectical materialism is a true premise, historical materialism, the application of the principles of dialectical materialism to social phenomena, must also be true. The derivation of the materialist conception of history from dialectical materialism provided the stepping stone for further deductions. Already in Anarchism or Socialism, Stalin held that, quote, Marxism is not only the theory of socialism, it is an integral world outlook, a philosophical system from which Marx's proletarian socialism logically follows. This philosophical system is called, quote, dialectical materialism, end quote, Stalin. In Dialectical and Historical Materialism, the book, Stalin took up this point and tried to show in detail that Stalin's materialist philosophy entails a number of socially and politically important consequences. Dialectical Materialism, edited by G.F. Alexandrov, the once authoritative exposition of Stalin's philosophical views, and Fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism, edited by O.V. Kusanin, performed the same tour de force, and even exceeded Stalin's efforts by their systematic thoroughness and exegetic ingenuity. The Soviet textbooks demonstrated the political significance of dialectical materialism, showing that dialectical materialism provided the basis for the prediction of the future in a scientific manner and for pursuing a scientifically grounded policy. The, quote, practical deductions, end quote, derived from dialectical materialism allowed the Soviet leaders to make right decisions and to resolve action dilemmas in numerous difficult situations. It hardly needs mentioning that Stalin and the authors of the Soviet textbooks were able to show that dialectical materialism involved certain political and social implications because they first formulated dialectical materialism in socio-cosmic terms. It has been pointed out earlier that in his presentation of dialectical materialism, Stalin adopted a peculiar order of exposition. Namely, Stalin dealt with the principal characteristics of matter before Stalin explained what matter was. For Stalin, this order of presentation served the purpose of making it absolutely sure that matter, whatever else matter might turn out to be, was endowed with characteristics which implied certain socially and politically desirable consequences, and which were, therefore, important from the socio-cosmic point of view. This is no speculation, for Stalin himself showed in detail that there was an intimate connection between the four dialectical characteristics of matter on the one hand and the policies of the Soviet state on the other. As Rosenthal and Uden observed, dialectical materialism was not only a set of propositions about the universe, but also the, quote, theoretical foundation, end quote, of the program, strategy, and tactics of the party of the proletariat. Stalin argued that if all phenomena of nature are interdependent and constitute an integral whole, quote, every social system and every special movement in history must be evaluated not from the standpoint of, quote, eternal justice, end quote, or some other preconceived idea, but from the standpoint of the conditions which gave rise to that system or that social movement and with which they are connected, end quote. Stalin, Dialectical and Historical Materialism. What underlies Stalin's inference from the law of universal connections is the basic premise of Hegel's evolutionary philosophy of history. Hegel taught that all successive historical systems are only transitory stages in the endless course of development of human society, that each stage is necessary and consequently justified for the time and conditions to which it owes its origin. And in fact, if new conditions it loses its justification, gives way to a higher stage which will also in its turn decay and perish. Stalin failed just as Hegel had to apply this evolutionary way of viewing the historical process to his own system. Stalin used the Hegelian premise to establish his own version of the doctrine that everything that is real must be reasonable and just. As Stalin put it, quote, everything depends on the conditions, time, and place, end quote. This is the maxim of moral positivism. Moral positivism holds that whatever is good, since everything must be judged by its own standards. As Stalin put it, quote, everything depends on the conditions, time, and place, end quote. This is the maxim of moral positivism. Moral positivism holds that whatever is good, since everything must be judged by its own standards, appropriate to time and place. Even the greatest thinkers cannot go, as Engels put it, quote, beyond the limits imposed upon them by their epoch, end quote. Engels, Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. In Stalin's opinion, the law of universal mutability entails the consequence that no social system and principle is permanent, quote, hence the capitalist system can be replaced by the socialist system, just at one time the feudal system was replaced by the capitalist system. Hence we must not base our orientation on the strata of society which are no longer developing, even though they at present constitute the predominant force, but on those strata which are developing and have a future before them, even though they at present do not constitute the predominant force. End quote. Stalin, Dialectical and Historical Materialism. The doctrine of leaps and the principle of the unity of opposites have been filled with a socio-cosmic content by Plekhanov and Lenin, and Stalin's contribution can be reduced to stating bluntly what the other two only implied. If the law of the transformation of quantity into quality by an abrupt change is a universal law, quote, then it is clear that the revolution made by oppressed classes are a quite natural and inevitable phenomenon. Hence the transition from capitalism to socialism and the liberation of the working class from the yoke of capitalism cannot be effected by slow changes, by reforms, but only by a qualitative change of the capitalist system by revolution. Hence, in order not to err in policy, one must be a revolutionary, not a reformist. End quote. Stalin, Dialectical and Historical Materialism. Finally, the principle of the unity and struggle of opposites entails the whole doctrine of class divisions and conflicts which provide the driving force of history. If development proceeds everywhere and always by way of the disclosure of internal contradictions, followed by the clash between opposite forces and the overcoming of the original contradiction, then it is clear that the class struggle and victory of the proletariat is a, quote, natural and inevitable phenomenon, end quote. Hence we must not cover up the contradictions of the capitalist system, but disclose and unravel them. We must not try to check the class struggle, but carry it to its conclusion. Did I say that this is a quote? This is a quote, sorry. Not sure if I said that or not. Quote, hence we must not cover up the contradictions of the capitalist system, but disclose and unravel them. We must not try to check the class struggle, but carry it to its conclusion. Hence, in order not to err in policy, one must pursue an uncompromising proletarian class policy, not a reformist policy of harmony of the interest of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, not a compromiser's policy of, quote, the growing capitalism into socialism, end quote. End quote. Stalin, Dialectical and Historical Materialism. By a socio-cosmic conception of the universe should be understood that view of the universe which attributes to the universe such features and regularities as could account for the superiority of a social and political order by cosmic laws rather than by the voluntary choice or decision of the policy makers. In this sense, Stalin's dialectical materialism is a socio-cosmic conception. Its main function is to provide the premises from which historical materialism and a number of more detailed socially and politically relevant consequences can allegedly be deduced. Historical materialism establishes a particular case of universal regularity inherent in the nature of the universe, in turn justifies definite policies of the party and personal decisions of its leaders, quote, as practical deductions, end quote, derived from the laws of development of society. As these laws are universally valid and objectively true, the practical consequences are, quote, objective truths, end quote, as well. Hence, as Stalin put it, quote, socialism is converted from a dream of a better future for humanity into a science, end quote. Stalin. Dialectical and Historical Materialism. The socio-cosmic concept of dialectical materialism helped to show, however deceitful these inferences might have been, that the policies of the party were not arbitrary decisions of fallible individuals. The leaders of the Soviet state made their decisions by a rigorous application of the rules of logic. Their policies were nothing but a deduction from scientific knowledge, and they themselves were only instruments of cosmic purpose. Since they helped to carry out the course of events determined by cosmic laws, their decisions were supported by the lawfulness and order of the universe. Voluntarism in politics and sociomorphism in cosmology supported each other. Voluntarism strengthened the tendency to formulate dialectical materialism in sociomorphic terms, and the sociomorphic conception of dialectical materialism favored and buttressed the voluntaristic interpretation of the Marxian doctrine. Together they made of dialectical materialism a system of beliefs which are socially important, though philosophically obscurantist. While Stalin's inadequate knowledge in philosophical matters is evident, Stalin had a perfect grasp of the social importance of philosophical ideas and was fully aware of the advantage which they can provide in effectively controlling social and political behavior. Having been duly simplified and codified in a brief catechism, dialectical materialism, with dialectical materialism's universal laws allegedly operating in nature as well as in human society, was turned by Stalin into a means of social manipulation and political mobilization of the masses. From a sociological point of view, it was irrelevant that the ostensible political implications of the Stalinist cosmological doctrine were not logically valid. The important point was that these fancied implications were believed to have been correctly inferred, and that they were widely accepted and supported. Consequently, the Stalinist version of dialectical materialism contributed to the successful imposition of definite ways of perceiving the world and to the strict enforcement of definite types of social behavior. On the other hand, disastrous consequences were associated with the conception of the universe from which moral positivism, the class struggle, the victory of the proletariat, the succession of the socio-cosmic formations, the inevitability of political revolutions, and even the vagaries of the party's internal dissensions, of its strategy and tactics could be deduced. Stalin's exposition of dialectical materialism could not be sustained and enforced without corrupting the critical ability and intellectual integrity of its adherents. It also tended to create social myths, that is, views about social reality unsupported by or conflicting with ascertainable facts. These myths undermined the very assumptions which they were supposed to serve. The unintended and unforeseen consequences revealed themselves fully after Stalin's death and culminated in the denunciation of the so-called, quote, cult of the individual, end quote, which was followed by the rejection of Stalinism as a valid interpretation of, quote, Marxism, end quote. The reasons for this denouement are easy to comprehend. We may be inclined to search for truth only because of its usefulness. Truth is useful since we can take advantage of the truth for the satisfaction of practical and emotional needs. But we can use truth in this way only as long as truth and usefulness are kept distinct. Disaster is bound to overcome us sooner or later if we fail to respect the distinction. Our intelligence and willpower, our cunning and ruthlessness may delay the final defeat, but they cannot prevent it. One should agree with William James that sometimes, quote, faith creates its own verification, end quote, and that in such cases it is, quote, part of the wisdom to believe what one desires, end quote. William James's rule applies to those ends whose attainment actually depends on a personal contribution of one sort or another, for in such cases faith urges and sustains a certain kind of behavior which is a prerequisite for the realization of a desired state of affairs. The premise, quote, faith creates its own verification, end quote, leads us, however, into calamity when it is extended to cover all cases, and when the modes of behavior required for the realization of ends are regarded as both the necessary and sufficient conditions for the attainment of the pursued objective. We are then driven into a magical frame of mind and into an utterly fantastic belief that is enough to utter some prescribed words of command or to perform certain prescribed actions to secure the achievement of the desired effect. The end. Thank you so much for listening. That is the end of part 2 of the book. The next part is part 3, which is titled Connections Between Dialectical and Historical Materialism. And the first section of that part is titled Marx's Philosophy of History. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.